Chloe Miller sat in her leather chair on the 20th floor of the Miller Corp building, looking out at the city of Washington, D.C. through the large window of her office. Below, the city lights pulsed as a constant reminder of the fast-paced and relentless world she lived in. Chloe had always been driven by ambitious goals, a ruthless executive who rose to the top of the tech company her father had founded. But success came at a price, and now, that price was about to be paid. Her phone vibrated on the desk. It was a message from her mother, Susan. "You can't run from this forever, Chloe. Your personal life is a mess. It's time to think about settling down." The same conversation as always, Chloe thought. She was constantly reminded that, no matter how respected she was in the business world, her personal life was still a point of disapproval for her family. Her mother, especially, was obsessed with the idea of seeing her married with children, as if that was the pinnacle of any successful woman. Susan couldn't accept that her daughter could be happy alone, dedicating herself to work and nothing else. But it wasn't just her mother who was pressuring her. The company's board of directors, led by Chloe's uncle Robert, had also been hinting that the image of a single, childless CEO might not be ideal for business. They wanted a public figure who embodied stability, someone investors could admire for both career and personal life. Chloe knew that if she wanted to keep her position at the helm of the company without them making moves to oust her, she had to find a solution. The decision to get married wasn't about love or romantic dreams. It was a pragmatic necessity, a strategic move. She had no time for the kind of relationship her family wanted for her, and even less for emotional involvement with someone. Her focus had always been, and always would be, on business, on the decisions that kept her ahead of everyone. Love was a distraction, a luxury she couldn't afford. That day, Chloe attended a meeting with a local hospital that was implementing one of her company's technology systems. Her presence wasn't required, but she liked to ensure everything was on track. The project involved digitizing patient data, and the hospital was an important client. During the visit, she was introduced to Dr. Ethan Collins, one of the hospital's most respected surgeons. Ethan was the opposite of Chloe in many ways. Young, still early in his career, he was focused on saving lives, not making money or climbing the career ladder. It was clear he didn't care about hospital politics, much less the social pressures many doctors face to live up to a certain public image. It was obvious that Ethan's world revolved around medicine, just as Chloe's revolved around her company. She watched him for a few minutes as he talked with another surgeon about a delicate procedure they were going to perform that afternoon. He had a calm and confident demeanor, an almost serene energy, but it was easy to notice the weight of responsibility he carried on his shoulders. During the corporate dinner that evening, when both had been invited by the hospital for an informal gathering, Chloe found herself intrigued by him. There was something about Ethan, something that made her believe he was the right person for her plan. Their eyes met more than once during dinner. It wasn't flirting, far from it. Chloe didn't find herself romantically attracted to him, but rather fascinated by his calmness and, in a way, by the fact that he seemed oblivious to the world she was involved in. When dessert was served and conversations began to disperse, Chloe decided it was time to act. She approached Ethan, who was sitting alone at the counter, enjoying what seemed to be a rare moment of peace. Most of the other doctors were still engaged in conversations around the table, discussing medical cases or the latest hospital news. Ethan observed the scene as if he were physically present, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere. "Dr. Collins, may I ask you a question?" Chloe's voice was direct as always. Ethan glanced at her, raising an eyebrow with curiosity. "Sure. What can I do for you, Mrs. Miller?" Chloe took a deep breath, feeling adrenaline begin to surge through her body. The proposal she was about to make was risky, but she saw no other option. "I need a husband." Ethan nearly choked on the sip of wine he had just taken. He set the glass on the table, turning to face her with a look of total disbelief. "Excuse me, what?" "I need a husband," Chloe repeated, her expression unwavering. "It's not what you think. I'm not asking for romance or anything like that. I'm talking about a contract. Something practical." The silence that followed was crushing. Ethan looked at her, still trying to process her words. He had heard bizarre proposals over the years, but this definitely topped anything he could imagine. "You gotta be kidding." Ethan shook his head, letting out a nervous laugh. "Is this some kind of prank?" Chloe continued, ignoring the uncomfortable laughter. I need to maintain the image of a stable personal life for professional reasons. My position at the company is at stake, and getting married would solve the problem. In return, I can guarantee funding for any research project you have in mind. Ethan's expression shifted from disbelief to curiosity. Now she had his attention. Wait, you're offering me funding? For what? Anything you want. I know the hospital struggles to approve some research. I have the contacts and the resources to change that. Chloe gave a small smile. But in return, you marry me. Temporarily. Ethan was silent, his eyes fixed on hers. He didn't know how to respond. The idea seemed as absurd as it was fascinating. Marry a woman he barely knew for a purely financial contract? But at the same time, the offer was tempting. He spent much of his time fighting for funding to expand his research, and her financing could be the answer to many of the problems he faced at the hospital. How long? He finally asked, crossing his arms. Chloe watched him for a moment, assessing his reactions. A year at most. We can divorce after that, no complications. I keep my position, you get your funding, and we both move on with our lives. Ethan was still hesitant. He was a man of principles and knew that this kind of agreement could have unexpected consequences. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the chance to make a difference in his field. The work he could do with that funding was incalculable. After a few moments of silence, Ethan finally responded, his voice firm but cautious. And what happens if this doesn't work? It will work, Chloe replied confidently, as if she had already predicted every possible scenario. We're both adults. We know what we want. No drama, no complications. And so, Ethan Collins, a dedicated and pragmatic surgeon, found himself facing a choice he never imagined he would have to make. Marry a cold and calculating woman for whom he felt absolutely nothing, but who offered exactly what he needed to achieve his dreams. They shook hands, sealing the deal that would forever change the course of their lives. The following week, Chloe barely had time to process the choice she had made. The pace of work at Miller Corp was relentless, with constant meetings and decisions that demanded her full attention. The contract with Ethan was already underway, and both their lawyers had prepared the documents. Every detail was meticulously planned. Chloe wanted everything to be practical and functional, with no room for complications. She reviewed the contract at the end of an exhausting afternoon, while gazing out her office window at the busy traffic in Washington. The terms were all there. A 1-year temporary marriage, no emotional involvement, no children, and no interference in either of their professional lives. When the year was up, the divorce would be executed cleanly and without litigation. Ethan would receive the funding he desperately needed to expand his research, and in return, Chloe would ensure that her image as CEO remained intact. Simple, straightforward, no surprises, or so she hoped. However, despite the cold and calculated nature of the agreement, there was a faint sense of discomfort she couldn't shake. Maybe it was the idea of giving up something so personal as marriage to solve a professional issue. Chloe had always been in complete control of everything, but now she was stepping into territory where emotions, no matter how much they were avoided, could complicate things. She knew Ethan seemed to be a rational person, but she also understood that not everything could be predicted in a contract. Across town, Ethan was also reflecting on what he was about to do. He was at the hospital, just finishing a complicated but successful heart surgery. As he washed his hands, his colleague and friend, Ben, walked into the scrub room with a tired smile. "So, I heard the tech queen made you an interesting proposal last week. Are you going to tell me what that means?" Ben teased, knowing Ethan had spent some time with Chloe during the corporate dinner. Ethan dried his hands and glanced at Ben, unsure how much to share. Ben had been his friend for a long time, and it was hard to keep things from him. But the agreement with Chloe was something Ethan was still processing. "It's more complicated than it seems," Ethan replied quietly. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, trying to find the right words. "She wants a fake marriage." Ben burst out laughing, clearly thinking Ethan was joking. But when he saw his friend's serious expression, the laughter died down. "Wait, you're serious? A fake marriage? What do you mean?" Ethan quickly explained what had happened, Chloe's proposal, and the contract they had both reviewed. Ben listened silently, absorbing every detail, and when Ethan finished, he was stunned. "This is crazy, man," Ben finally said. "You're really going to marry a woman you barely know? All because of a contract? Even if it's only for a year, This is going to mess with your life in ways you can't even imagine. Ethan knew Ben was right, but he also knew how much that funding meant to him. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to advance his research on heart disease in children, something he had always been passionate about. Chloe's money could save countless lives, and Ethan wasn't willing to let that chance slip away, no matter how insane the plan seemed. I know it sounds crazy, Ben, but this is an opportunity one can't pass up. She doesn't want anything more than a business arrangement, no personal involvement. And honestly, I'm not looking for that either right now. Ben shook his head, still skeptical. I just hope you know what you're getting yourself into. This kind of thing never ends the way we think it will. Ethan didn't respond, but the lingering doubt he had been feeling since Chloe's proposal grew stronger. Unlike her, who saw the marriage as a purely practical solution, he knew that once involved, things could spiral out of control. He had seen it in patients and friends over the years. Emotions are unpredictable, and even the most meticulous plans can crumble when the heart gets involved. The following Friday, Chloe and Ethan met at the District of Columbia courthouse to sign the papers. The room was cold and formal, the perfect setting for a contract devoid of emotion. Ethan arrived first, waiting for Chloe in one of the brown leather chairs arranged in a row. He wore a dark suit, more fitting for a real wedding ceremony, and felt oddly out of place. When Chloe entered, also impeccably dressed in a gray suit, she appeared as cold and calculating as ever. She gave a brief nod, expressionless, before sitting next to him. The silence between them was palpable, broken only by the sound of the notary flipping through the papers on his desk. "Ethan, Chloe, everything is in order here," said the notary, not looking up from the documents. "You've already reviewed everything, so now it's just a matter of signing in the indicated places." Chloe took the pen first, without hesitation, and signed her name firmly. When she handed the pen to Ethan, he paused for a second. It was a simple contract, but the implications were anything but simple. He glanced at Chloe, hoping for some sign that she, too, felt the gravity of the situation, but all he found was the same impassive expression. With a quick stroke, Ethan signed the document and handed the papers to the notary, who stamped them and smiled at both of them. "Congratulations, you are now officially married." Chloe thanked him and stood up, already with her phone in hand, ready to return to the office. For her, it was just another task to be checked off the list. "So, I'll see you at the dinner we scheduled with the board on Monday?" she asked matter-of-factly, as she was already walking toward the door. Ethan nodded, still processing what had just happened. "Yes, of course." Chloe left without looking back, leaving Ethan alone in the room for a few minutes. He stood up slowly, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. He knew the marriage was purely practical, but something inside him couldn't shake the feeling that by signing those papers, he had crossed an invisible line, one that wouldn't be so easy to step back from. When Ethan finally left the courthouse, the late afternoon sun reflected off the buildings of Washington, and the city continued its frenetic pace, as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had changed. He was married, and although he knew the marriage wasn't real, the consequences of his actions were beginning to weigh on him in unexpected ways. The dinner with the Miller Court Board on Monday was Chloe and Ethan's first public appearance as a couple. The luxurious restaurant in downtown Washington, with its glass walls and view of the Capitol, was crowded, but at the table reserved for the board and their spouses, the atmosphere was formal, almost cold. Chloe, accustomed to corporate settings, seemed completely at ease. She moved among the guests, engaging in brief conversations with the executives, reinforcing her image as a powerful and untouchable woman. Ethan, on the other hand, felt out of place. He sat beside Chloe, watching her interact with the others, answering questions about their marriage as if she were discussing a business merger. She smiled at the right moments, made appropriate comments, and occasionally glanced at Ethan to ensure he was keeping up with the narrative. To everyone present, they seemed like the perfect couple, the determined executive and the renowned doctor. But Ethan knew that behind that facade, the reality was far different. While Chloe stood to greet one of the board's senior members, Robert Miller, her uncle, and one of the key figures behind the pressure she was under, Ethan was left alone at the table. He observed the environment, trying to adapt to the atmosphere, which was so different from the hospital. There, things were straightforward, problems were visible and concrete. Here, Everything seemed shrouded in a layer of falseness and a game of appearances. "So, Ethan, how's married life treating you so far?" Robert's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Robert was a tall man with graying hair and a sharp smile. He sat down next to Ethan, pouring himself a glass of wine as he observed him with interest. It was clear Robert was testing Ethan, looking for any sign of weakness or hesitation. Ethan took a deep breath before responding. "It's been great. We're adjusting to the new routine, but things are going well," he said, keeping a neutral but confident tone. He knew he had to maintain the facade Chloe had requested. For Robert and the rest of the board, it was crucial that the marriage appeared authentic. Robert leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You know, Chloe is a difficult woman. Always has been. Very much like her father. Determined to win at everything, even in things that should be more personal." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He knew that anything he said could be used against Chloe or himself in the future. Instead, he opted for neutrality. "Chloe knows what she wants and how to get it. I think that's what makes her so successful." Robert chuckled softly, as if he knew something Ethan didn't. "Yes, certainly. Well, I'm glad the two of you are doing well. After all, a CEO's personal life is almost as important as their professional performance, isn't it?" Before Ethan could respond, Chloe returned to the table. She smiled at her uncle, but her gaze quickly shifted to Ethan, as if assessing the situation. "Is everything okay here?" she asked directly. "Of course, dear," Robert replied with a forced smile, standing up. "Just a little man-to-man talk. You two seem to be doing great." Chloe maintained her smile, but as Robert walked away, she sat down beside Ethan and observed him for a few seconds. "Did he ask anything?" she inquired quietly, with poorly disguised concern. "Not much. Just made some comments about how determined you are." Ethan smiled slightly, trying to ease the tension. "He seems like someone who's always testing people." Chloe rolled her eyes. "He is. He always is. Robert never misses an opportunity to try to undermine my position. He thinks that, as my father's older brother, he should have more influence here." Ethan nodded, beginning to understand more about the family and business dynamics surrounding Chloe. He had always known there was more behind her facade of complete control, but this was the first time he was seeing up close the tension she faced. However, before he could comment, the dinner was interrupted by the waiter, who began serving the main course. Their eyes met briefly. There were no words, but something passed between them, a silent understanding that, even though the marriage was a sham, they were now entangled in a web of appearances and expectations that would require much more than just the signed contract. At the end of the dinner, Chloe and Ethan left the restaurant together, followed by the curious gazes of the board members. They walked in silence through the streets of Washington, the lights from the buildings reflecting in the puddles left by the recent rain. Chloe kept her gaze fixed ahead, as if calculating the next step. Ethan, meanwhile, was lost in thought, still processing the weight of the evening. It was only when they reached Chloe's car, parked on a side street, that she finally spoke. "You did well. Robert isn't easy to deal with, but it seems like you convinced him." Ethan shrugged, opening the passenger door. "I just try to follow your lead. You make it look easy." Chloe sighed, exhausted. "Making it look easy is the hardest part, and this is just the beginning. Next month will be full of dinners like this. Investor events, press meetings. We need to keep the story consistent." Ethan settled into the car, turning to her before replying. "I get it, but I'm going to need your help with this. I'm not used to this kind of thing." Chloe nodded, starting the car. "I know. I'll guide you through the process. We just need to remember this is an agreement. If we keep it that way, everything will go according to plan." The drive back was quiet, both of them immersed in their own thoughts. Ethan watched the streets pass by the window, thinking about how his life had changed so quickly. He had married for a contract, gotten involved in a world completely different from his own, and now he was dealing with people who played high-level political games. Part of him wondered if he had made the right choice, but another part knew that, at least for now, there was no turning back. Chloe dropped him off at his apartment without ceremony. "I'll talk to you tomorrow. I'll send you the schedule for the upcoming events," she said, as if they were discussing a business meeting. "Sure. Good night, Chloe," Ethan replied, getting out of the car and watching her drive away. When he entered his apartment, the quietness of the place seemed amplified by the contrast with the dinner full of people. He took off his jacket, throwing it on the sofa, and went straight to the kitchen to get a glass of water. His thoughts were still on Chloe and everything that had happened that evening. Even though he had no feelings for her, Ethan couldn't help but think about how lonely this arrangement seemed for both of them. Chloe might be a successful woman with a brilliant career, but it was clear to him that there was a fragility behind all that control. She kept the world at a distance, building impenetrable barriers around herself, as if trusting someone was too dangerous. Ethan wasn't naive. He knew part of him was in this situation out of self-interest as well. But that night, after observing Chloe's behavior with her family and the board, he began to realize that the price she paid for her position of power was far higher than he had imagined. The days following the dinner with the board brought an even more intense routine for Chloe and Ethan. The schedule of public events was tight, and Chloe, as always, handled every detail with the precision of someone in complete control. She sent Ethan the dates and details in advance, and he, now more accustomed to her pace, tried to prepare for what was coming. Even so, it was still all very strange to him. Ethan had never been someone accustomed to public life. At the hospital, his focus was always on patients, surgeries, and the concrete matters of medicine. But now, he found himself constantly in the spotlight, by Chloe's side, being introduced to investors, journalists, and members of Washington's political elite. The perfect couple facade that Chloe had built was impressive, and Ethan did his best to follow her lead, answering questions politely and maintaining his composure. It was a game he didn't know well, but with Chloe by his side, he was adapting. One night, after a charity event where Chloe had delivered a brilliant speech about the future of technology, they found themselves in the car again, in silence. Chloe was exhausted, but she didn't let it show. Her posture remained upright, her eyes focused on the window as she watched the city lights flicker outside. "You did well today," she said, suddenly breaking the silence. "The investors like you." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the sudden mention of his performance. "Me? I didn't do anything special. You're the one who commanded the room. You have a natural way of dealing with people. That makes a difference. Investors want someone they can trust, and you project that trust." She spoke with the same calculated tone as always, but there was a slight acknowledgement in her voice, something Ethan didn't expect to hear. He shrugged, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the compliment. "I'm trying to get used to all this. I'm not exactly the kind of person who handles the spotlight well." Chloe shifted her gaze from the window and looked at him briefly. "No one is born knowing how to handle it. The point is knowing how to use what you have to your advantage." Ethan remained silent, reflecting on those words. Chloe was indeed a master at turning any situation into something that benefited her. He was beginning to understand that behind her cold demeanor, there was a calculating and strategic mind that always worked on multiple fronts. Even in moments of exhaustion, she seemed to be 2 steps ahead of everyone around her. When they arrived at Ethan's apartment, she stopped the car and looked at him, as usual, already ready to resume her own life once he got out. "The next event is on Friday, a meeting with a group of tech investors. We need to be ready for it. I'll send you the details tomorrow." Ethan nodded, but before getting out of the car, he hesitated for a moment. "Chloe, you don't have to do this." She frowned, confused. "Do what? Be like this all the time? You act like a machine? I understand that it's part of what you've built, but sometimes it seems like you forget that you're human too." Chloe stared at him for a few seconds, surprised by the comment. It wasn't common for anyone to talk to her like that, especially someone with whom she had a purely professional agreement. But instead of responding immediately, she looked away, focusing back on the road ahead. "That doesn't matter," she said, her tone more distant. "What matters is that everything works. People who let emotions get in the way lose focus. I can't afford that." Ethan didn't push the issue, realizing he had touched on a sensitive subject. He knew Chloe was used to keeping all her barriers up, and any attempt to break through them would be seen as a threat. So, he got out of the car without saying anything else, just waving goodbye. Chloe watched as he entered his building, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel something she rarely admitted: fatigue. Not physical, but emotional. She was exhausted from keeping control all the time, but she saw no other way to survive in her world. The next morning, Chloe was in her office when she received an unexpected call from her mother. It was rare for Susan to call her during work hours, which immediately put her on alert. "Chloe, we need to talk." Her mother's voice was firm, but there was an underlying tension that didn't go unnoticed. "I'm in the middle of a meeting, Mom. Can it be quick?" "No. I need you to come to the family house tomorrow night. It's important." Chloe felt a wave of frustration. Her relationship with her mother had always been marked by a fragile balance between obligation and resistance. Susan was never satisfied, no matter how much Chloe achieved. If it wasn't her career, it was her personal life. And now that Chloe had resolved the marriage issue, she could already foresee the next battleground. "My schedule is full, Mom. Can it wait until the end of the week?" "No, it can't. I spoke with your Uncle Robert, and he'll be here too. It's about the company, Chloe. Something you need to know." That caught Chloe by surprise. If Robert was involved, the situation wasn't just a personal matter. There was something more going on, and the prospect of dealing with both her mother and her uncle at the same time was far from pleasant. She sighed, resigned. "Fine. I'll be there tomorrow." When she hung up, Chloe sat in silence for a few minutes, processing the call. Her mind automatically began working, considering all the possible scenarios that could be behind her mother's urgency. She knew that whatever the reason, there would be tension. It wasn't like her mother to involve Robert without a good cause, and Robert only showed up when something was at stake. At the end of the day, Chloe sent a quick message to Ethan, informing him of the change in plans. "I'll need to go to my mother's house tomorrow night. Something about the company. I may not be able to send you the event schedule until Friday." Ethan replied almost immediately. "Understood. That's fine by me. Good luck with your mother." Chloe read the message and felt a slight wave of apprehension. There was something strange about knowing that now she had to keep someone informed about her life, even if it was on a superficial level. Ethan wasn't part of her personal world, but he was present enough that she had to consider him in her decisions. That made her uncomfortable, as if she were opening a small breach in her carefully constructed fortress. The next morning, Chloe prepared for the visit to the family house, as if she were heading to a business meeting. The large mansion in Georgetown was a constant reminder of her childhood, filled with expectations and demands. Upon arriving, she was greeted by her mother's stern look, who was waiting for her in the living room with Robert, already seated with an expression that mixed disdain and calculation. "Chloe, thank you for coming," said Susan, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What's the problem?" Chloe went straight to the point. She knew the conversation wouldn't be pleasant, so she preferred to get right to it. Robert was the first to speak. "There are some issues that need to be addressed in the company. Your management is being questioned by some members of the board." Chloe frowned, surprised. "Question? How so?" "Some investors are concerned about the direction the company is taking. They think you're too focused on certain areas and neglecting others that are crucial for growth. And there have been suggestions that maybe someone with more experience should take over." Chloe's blood ran cold. She knew Robert had always wanted more control over the company, and now it seemed he was starting to move his pieces on the board. But before she could respond, her mother intervened. "Chloe, we're not saying you've done anything wrong, but the pressure is mounting. And with your recent marriage, maybe it's time for you to consider a different approach. Less centralized, more delegated." Chloe kept her expression neutral, but inside, she was seething. They were trying to push her out of the company she had dedicated her life to leading, and they were using the marriage she had orchestrated as a distraction against her. But she wouldn't give in, not without a fight. Chloe remained silent for a few seconds, trying to process what she had just heard. The insinuation from her mother and Robert hit her in an almost surreal way. They were subtly suggesting that she was no longer capable of leading Miller Corp on her own. It was a calculated, low blow, and she knew Robert was behind it. Her uncle had been waiting for an opportunity like this for years, always lurking, always trying to insert himself into the company's decisions. And now, with some investors questioning her choices, he saw a chance to inch closer to the power he had always craved. The living room of her mother's house, with its opulent and heavy decor, felt suffocating at that moment. Chloe could feel the weight of all the expectations and judgments hanging over her. The woman who had always been in control, always ahead of every major decision, now saw her position threatened. Even the marriage she had crafted as a solution was being used against her. "So, you think I'm losing control of the company because I got married?" Chloe finally broke the silence, her voice controlled but tinged with slight bitterness. She looked directly at Robert, refusing to show any sign of weakness. Robert crossed his arms, a cold smile playing on his lips. It's not about losing control, Chloe. It's about priorities. Some investors believe that now that you're married, you might not have the same focus as before. It's natural. Everyone understands that personal life can interfere with corporate decisions. Chloe felt her blood boil, but she kept her composure. She knew that exploding would be exactly what Robert wanted. I can balance both. I've always balanced work with my personal life, and that won't change now. Susan, who had remained silent until then, sighed deeply. Honey, this isn't criticism. It's just that maybe you need to start delegating more. Trust others. Robert is willing to help with that process. He has the necessary experience and can lighten the load you carry. Chloe rolled her eyes internally. It was clear that her mother was being manipulated by Robert, and the worst part was that Susan didn't see it. To her mother, Robert was the older brother, a respectable businessman who had always been around. But to Chloe, he was an opportunist, waiting for the slightest weakness to act. I appreciate the concern, Mom, but I don't need help leading the company. Chloe stood up slowly, adjusting her skirt, signaling that the conversation was nearing its end for her. I can handle the investors, the company, and my marriage without any problems. Robert stood as well, visibly displeased with Chloe's firmness. Chloe, no one is saying you're not capable. We're just suggesting that, for the good of the company, it might be wise to reconsider your approach. My approach has always worked, she replied with a sarcastic smile. And until something proves otherwise, it will continue to work. The silence that followed was tense. Susan glanced between the two of them, realizing that nothing more would be resolved there. Chloe, dear, at least think about what we've said. We're not against you. Chloe grabbed her bag and looked at her mother. I know you believe that, but trust me when I say I know what I'm doing. With that, she turned and left the house, without looking back. The fresh Georgetown air enveloped her as she crossed the door, but Chloe still felt the weight of the discussion on her shoulders. She got into the car and took a deep breath, trying to collect herself. The drive back to her apartment was spent in silence, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Every word Robert had said echoed inside her, but Chloe knew she couldn't let it shake her. She had worked too hard to get where she was, and if Robert thought he could undermine her authority, he was gravely mistaken. However, when she arrived at her apartment, the mental and emotional exhaustion began to take over. For the first time in a long while, Chloe felt vulnerable. She tossed her bag onto the sofa, kicked off her shoes, and went straight to the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine. The exhaustion wasn't just from work or the constant corporate battles, but from the feeling that, little by little, things were slipping out of her control. She hated that feeling. She was about to settle down on the couch with a glass of wine when her phone vibrated. It was a message from Ethan. How did things go with your mom? Everything okay? Chloe stared at the screen for a few seconds, unsure of how to respond. The fact that Ethan had cared enough to ask was strange. She wasn't used to anyone showing concern for her, especially not someone who wasn't truly part of her personal life. Their marriage was a contract, nothing more, and yet, there he was, sending a casual message as if he genuinely wanted to know. After a moment of hesitation, Chloe replied, "Tense, but nothing I can't handle." The response came almost immediately. "If you need anything, I'm here." Chloe smirked slightly. The idea of needing anyone, least of all Ethan, was almost laughable to her. But at the same time, there was something comforting about knowing he was there, even if only as a facade. She didn't respond, but she kept her phone in her hand for a few more minutes, thoughtful. Ethan, with his calm and distant demeanor, was becoming a more constant presence in her life than she had anticipated. They barely knew each other, and yet, he seemed willing to help her in some way. Chloe had always maintained complete control over all her relationships, keeping them at a safe distance. But with Ethan, the barriers were becoming less clear. The next morning, Chloe was back in the office, as if the meeting with her mother and Robert had never happened. Her focus was total, as always. She reviewed reports, read emails, and prepared for upcoming meetings. But the issue with the investors that Robert mentioned lingered in the back of her mind. She knew she would need to act quickly to resolve it before he could gain more ground. Around noon, while she was reviewing an important contract, her assistant entered the office. "Mrs. Miller, Dr. Collins is here to see you." Chloe frowned. Ethan never showed up at her office unannounced. Curious, she asked him to come in. When Ethan entered, he looked more casual than usual, but there was something in his expression that indicated he wasn't just there for a courtesy visit. He approached her desk, glancing briefly at the documents she was reviewing. "Is everything okay?" Chloe asked, not missing a beat. "I don't remember us having anything scheduled for today." Ethan shook his head, smiling slightly. "No, we didn't. I just thought you might use a break." Chloe raised an eyebrow, surprised. "A break? I'm fine, Ethan." "I know you are," he replied, crossing his arms and leaning slightly against the desk. "But I also know you're dealing with a lot, and sometimes, even the most controlled people need a break." Chloe looked at him for a few seconds, evaluating his intentions. She was used to people offering advice or support, but always with some interest behind it. Ethan, however, seemed genuine. He didn't want anything from her. That disarmed her a little. "What exactly are you suggesting I do?" Chloe asked, with a hint of irony. Ethan smiled, but there was sincerity in his eyes. "I'm suggesting you leave this office for a few hours. Go breathe some fresh air, have lunch, or do anything that isn't work." Chloe leaned back in her chair, a short laugh escaping her lips. "Are you serious? I have a company to run." "Yes, and you do that very well. But if you keep pushing yourself, you'll end up burning out." He shrugged. "It's just a suggestion. You can come back to work tomorrow and nothing will change. But at least for today, let someone else handle things." Chloe stayed silent, considering what he had said. It was something she never did, delegating or simply stepping back. But at that moment, she felt tempted. Maybe because she knew Ethan was right, or maybe because she was tired of keeping up appearances all the time. "Do you have any idea of what I should do?" she asked, still skeptical, but curious. Ethan smiled more openly now. "Actually, yes. I was thinking of taking you to a place I like, away from all this hustle. If you're up for it." Chloe hesitated, but something in his eyes made her consider the idea. She knew she could refuse and continue with her routine, but for some reason, she decided to accept. "All right," she said, standing up slowly, "but only for a few hours." Chloe was still processing the fact that she had agreed to leave the office with Ethan. It was completely out of character for her. Never in her entire career had she allowed someone to interrupt her work routine. She was known for her relentless discipline, her ability to stay focused even in the most stressful circumstances. But at that moment, something about Ethan, perhaps the simplicity of his approach, or his apparent lack of ulterior motives, made her lower her guard for a moment. As they left the Miller Court building, the fresh Washington, D.C. air hit Chloe's face, and she felt something unexpected, a slight sense of relief. The streets were as busy as ever, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't have a set destination, no schedule to keep. She simply followed Ethan, who walked beside her, unhurried. He was leading her away from the frantic pace she so often embraced. At first, Chloe maintained a rigid posture, saying little, her high heels clicking firmly and steadily on the pavement. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, with his hands in the pockets of his coat. He knew this side of her, the woman who kept everything under control, always one step ahead, never allowing herself to relax. He knew it would be a challenge to get Chloe to truly disconnect, but he wasn't in a hurry. As they walked through the busy city streets, he deliberately chose quieter routes, leading her down tree-lined, peaceful streets, far from the usual chaos they both knew so well. "So, where exactly are we going?" Chloe finally broke the silence, her curiosity getting the better of her. Ethan shrugged, a soft smile appearing on his lips. "A quiet place, nothing too impressive, but I think you'll like it." She glanced at him sideways, trying to guess what he had in mind. This man, with his unnerving calm, was an enigma to her. Chloe was used to dealing with people who wanted something from her, people who approached with clear intentions, usually tied to power, money, or influence. Ethan, however, seemed genuinely uninterested in those aspects of her life. That threw her off balance. After a few minutes, Ethan stopped in front of a small cafe tucked between two large trees on a quiet street in Georgetown. It wasn't the kind of place Chloe usually frequented. She was more accustomed to luxury restaurants, sophisticated environments where everyone knew each other, and where business deals were discussed behind closed doors. But the cafe Ethan had chosen was cozy, with a simple facade and large windows that allowed natural light to fill the interior. Ethan held the door open for Chloe, who walked in hesitantly, observing the place with curiosity. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the subtle scent of fresh bread filled the air. The walls were lined with shelves of old books, and there were only a few tables scattered around, all occupied by people who seemed to be there to escape the city's fast pace, seeking refuge. "This is your idea of a quiet place?" Chloe asked with a hint of irony, though she couldn't hide her slight interest. Ethan chuckled softly, sitting at a table by the window. "I come here whenever I can. It's one of the few places in DC where no one rushes you. You can spend hours here, reading or just enjoying the silence." Chloe sat in the chair across from him, still eyeing the place warily, but something inside her began to relax. She looked around, watching the few people who seemed oblivious to what was happening outside the cafe's doors. There was a calm here that she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, perhaps, Chloe allowed herself not to think about the next step, the next meeting, or Robert. "I understand why you like this place," she said after a few minutes, her voice softer than before. "It's different. Is that a compliment?" Ethan teased, raising his hand to catch the waitress's attention. Chloe smirked slightly, something rare for her in non-professional settings. "I think so." The waitress, a young woman with a warm smile, approached the table. Ethan ordered 2 coffees and a slice of lemon pie without even consulting Chloe, which made her raise an eyebrow in surprise. "Lemon pie?" Chloe asked when the waitress left. "You'll like it," he said confidently. "Trust me." Chloe rolled her eyes slightly, but with a hint of amusement. It wasn't common for someone to make decisions for her, let alone do so casually. But with Ethan, it didn't feel like an intrusion, just a simple, almost innocent gesture. She realized she was letting herself go along with the situation, something she hadn't done in a long time. As they waited for the coffee, Ethan looked at Chloe more closely. He could see the subtle changes in her, the way her shoulders were a little less tense, how her eyes weren't as focused on some distant point, but present in the moment. He didn't want to invade her personal space, but it was clear that Chloe was carrying a much heavier burden than she let on. Something about the meeting with her mother had shaken her rigid control, and he could see the cracks in her facade. "Do you want to talk about what happened with your mother?" Ethan asked lightly, without pushing. Chloe, who had been looking out the window, slowly turned to face him. For a second, she seemed to close off again, as if deciding whether to share something so personal with him. But then, she sighed, as if surrendering to the inevitability of speaking. "It's the same as always. My mother and my uncle, trying to convince me that I can't handle the company on my own. And now, they're using my marriage as another excuse to question my leadership." Ethan nodded, listening attentively. "They think your marriage will distract you?" "Yes. And Robert is waiting for any sign of weakness to try and take control of the company. He's always wanted that." Chloe crossed her arms, her posture becoming defensive again. "But I'm not going to let him. I worked my whole life to get where I am. No one is going to take that from me." The intensity in Chloe's voice was undeniable. She was fierce when it came to protecting what was hers, and Ethan could see how much it consumed her. He knew her career was an essential part of her identity, but at the same time, he couldn't help but wonder how much of that fight was eating away at the person behind the professional. "I believe you can handle it," Ethan said calmly, "but you don't have to do everything alone all the time." Chloe remained silent for a moment, processing his words. "I've always done everything alone. I'm not going to start depending on someone now." Ethan smiled gently. "I'm not talking about depending on someone. I'm talking about accepting help when it's needed. Sometimes, it's smarter to work with others than to try to carry the world on your shoulders." The waitress arrived with the coffee and pie, interrupting the conversation for a brief moment. When she left, Chloe picked up her cup and took a sip, feeling the warmth of the coffee. Ethan's words lingered in her mind. She didn't like the idea of needing help, but he wasn't suggesting it the way Robert did. It wasn't about control or power, but something more subtle. Chloe realized that, with Ethan, there was a fundamental difference. He didn't want to take anything from her. He was just there. "I'll think about it," Chloe finally replied, her voice softer. Ethan smiled. "That's enough for now." As they finished the pie, the atmosphere between them softened even more. Chloe was beginning to let her guard down, little by little, something she hadn't planned to do, but which was happening naturally with Ethan. She was far from fully trusting him, but she no longer saw him as just part of a contract. He was there, truly present in her life in a way that was starting to go beyond the agreement they had made. The afternoon with Ethan at the small cafe in Georgetown had been an unexpected break in Chloe's routine. When she returned to the office, she felt a little lighter, as though that brief moment of disconnection had given her some much-needed breathing room. But as soon as she re-entered the world of Miller Corp, the familiar pressures, both familial and corporate, quickly began to pile up again. The memory of her conversation with her mother and Robert still loomed over her like a shadow, and the threat to her position in the company felt more real with each passing day. In the days that followed, Chloe dove back into work with renewed intensity. Her strategy was clear: address the investors' concerns and ensure her leadership wouldn't be questioned. She called meetings with key shareholders, presented new expansion proposals, and emphasized the results the company had achieved under her management. It was like a game of chess, and Chloe made each move carefully, calculating every step to protect her position. Meanwhile, Ethan continued playing his part in their agreement. They attended corporate events and social gatherings together, where he always presented himself with the same calm competence that had earned him respect at the hospital. To all appearances, they were the perfect couple, and the image Chloe worked so hard to maintain was preserved flawlessly. Ethan played his role impeccably, always attentive to what was expected of him, but without ever seeming forced. He was there when needed, but never interfered too much in Chloe's life. Still, Chloe began to notice a subtle change in the dynamic between them. Before, everything had seemed purely contractual, but now, there were moments of genuine connection, like small sparks of something she couldn't quite identify. When they were in public, Ethan showed a deep understanding of how to interact with the people around him. He was polite, attentive, and his natural charisma complemented Chloe's controlled demeanor. Together, they formed a powerful combination, and it was easy to see how the investors and executives at Miller Corp were drawn to that image. One night, after a gala event at a luxurious hotel in Washington, Chloe and Ethan returned to Chloe's apartment, which was in one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. She invited him up, something she didn't usually do. Normally, they would part ways after events, each returning to their own life. But that night, Chloe felt an inexplicable restlessness, a need to prolong her time with Ethan, even if only for casual conversation. As they ascended in the mirrored elevator, the silence between them was comfortable, but there was an underlying tension. Chloe was tired, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion that bothered her. There was something deeper, something she wasn't used to confronting. When the elevator doors opened, she invited Ethan into her apartment, and, curious, he accepted. Chloe's apartment was exactly what he had expected: spacious, elegant, and minimalist in design. Everything seemed meticulously calculated, from the designer furniture to the panoramic view of Washington through the glass windows. Not a single object was out of place, nothing suggesting that Chloe had a life outside of work. It was almost as if the apartment was an extension of her public persona, controlled and perfect. "Would you like something to drink?" Chloe asked as she made her way to the kitchen without waiting for a response. "Just water would be great," Ethan replied, slowly walking through the living room, taking in the surroundings. Chloe returned with 2 glasses of water, handing one to him before sitting on the sofa, casually crossing her legs. Ethan settled into the armchair across from her, observing her for a moment. There was something different about Chloe that night, a kind of vulnerability he had never seen before. She seemed less in control, more tired, and perhaps a little more open than usual. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence, his tone genuinely concerned. Chloe gave a faint smile, but with little enthusiasm. "I'm tired. That's all." "I imagine," Ethan replied. "You've been under a lot of pressure, especially with what's going on at Miller Corp." She nodded, agreeing, but her expression darkened. "Sometimes, it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. I work all the time, do everything that's expected of me, and yet, there's always someone trying to take what's mine." Ethan took a sip of water, pausing before responding. He knew that what Chloe was dealing with was much more than just a business issue. There was something deeper, a constant battle to prove she deserved the position she had earned. He understood that feeling to some extent. At the hospital, there was always someone ready to question his decisions, someone looking to compete or challenge him. But what he faced was different from the burden Chloe carried. And, do you think you need to keep proving that to people? Ethan asked, looking directly at her. Chloe hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the question. She had never thought of it that way. Proving her worth had always been an intrinsic part of who she was. From an early age, her life had revolved around exceeding expectations, being the best, ensuring that no one could doubt her abilities. But hearing Ethan's question, she realized she might be stuck in an endless fight she had created for herself. I don't know if it's something I can avoid, Chloe finally said, her voice softer. It's like I don't know how to be any other way. What am I without this control, without this need? Ethan leaned forward slightly, still maintaining eye contact. You're much more than that. You know that. And what you've achieved, you don't need to keep proving. What you've already done speaks for itself. Chloe was silent, processing his words. No one had ever said something like that to her before. Everyone always reinforced the need for her to maintain control, to keep pushing herself, as if her identity was entirely tied to her work. But Ethan was suggesting there was something beyond that, something she had perhaps ignored or forgotten. And what do you think that is? Chloe asked, almost challenging him to answer. Ethan smiled slightly, relaxing back into the armchair. I think you're someone who deserves more than just living to prove something to others. Maybe it's time for you to figure out what else there is for you besides Miller Corp. Those words hung in the air, echoing in Chloe's mind. She didn't know how to react to that. For so long, her life had been defined by her achievements, by her work, by her control. The idea that there was something beyond that, something she hadn't explored, was both frightening and intriguing. After a few minutes of silence, Chloe finally stood up. I think you should go. I have an early meeting tomorrow. Ethan nodded, understanding that he had touched on a sensitive subject. He stood, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door. But before leaving, he looked at Chloe one more time. You don't have to decide anything now, he said calmly. Just think about what I said. Chloe didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him leave, the sound of the door closing echoing in the empty apartment. Once alone, Chloe returned to the sofa, feeling strangely vulnerable. Ethan's words continued to reverberate in her mind. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to question what she was truly seeking, and whether the constant need for control was really what made her happy, or if there was something more that she hadn't yet discovered. Chloe spent the night tossing and turning in bed, unable to shake Ethan's words from her mind. He had touched on something she had always refused to confront. What was she beyond her work? What would be left if, one day, she lost control of Miller Corp, or worse, lost control of herself? She had built her life around her career, molding every aspect of her personality to fit the image she needed to project an unbeatable, unyielding woman who didn't allow for weakness. But for the first time, Chloe questioned how far that path could take her. The next morning, her alarm went off before the sun had risen, and Chloe, having barely slept, got up automatically. Her body followed the same routine: a quick shower, choosing the perfect outfit, and grabbing a strong coffee before heading out for another day of corporate battles. But beneath those automatic gestures, her mind was restless. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting her hair, she wondered if that impenetrable image, which had defined her for so long, was still enough. The day at Miller Corp started like any other. Back-to-back meetings, presentations, and endless emails. Chloe maintained her usual air of confidence, her impeccable posture, and her precise answers. But internally, the questions Ethan had planted were beginning to take root. Between meetings with shareholders, she noticed something she had never recognized before: a slight feeling of emptiness, as if solving financial problems and handling daily challenges no longer satisfied the growing need within her. By late afternoon, as she finished a final meeting with the development team, her phone vibrated on the desk. It was a message from Ethan. He had made it clear the night before that she could reflect on their conversation, but the fact that he had been on her mind ever since bothered her. She hesitated before picking up the phone to read the message. Are you okay? Just wanted to see if you had time to think about what we talked about. Chloe stood still, staring at the screen. The simplicity of the question made her feel a small pang of frustration. She was always fine. That was how she dealt with life, keeping everything under control, without allowing for any sign of weakness or vulnerability. But now, with Ethan, she found herself unable to give the same superficial response she usually gave to everyone. He had made her think about things she preferred not to face, and that made her uncomfortable. Without responding immediately, she turned off the phone and focused on finishing the remainder of her workday. But as night fell and the offices began to empty, Chloe found herself alone in the vast conference room, reports in front of her and her mind elsewhere. The silence of the space, which normally helped her focus, now felt oppressive. She looked out the window at the view of Washington, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely alone. A few minutes later, a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Not expecting anyone, Chloe straightened and called out, "Come in." To her surprise, Ethan appeared at the door, his expression calm, but with a touch of concern. He was dressed casually, not in the formal suits he wore at events or public engagements. He seemed more approachable, in a way that made Chloe relax slightly. "Sorry to show up unannounced," he began, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I was at the hospital nearby, and thought I'd stop by to see how you were doing." Chloe looked at him, surprised to see him there, but something about his unexpected presence calmed her. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice didn't sound as convincing as she had hoped. Ethan moved closer, sitting in the chair across from her. "That doesn't sound very convincing." Chloe sighed, leaning back in her chair, and for the first time since they'd entered into their agreement, she didn't feel the need to keep up appearances. There was something about the way Ethan carried himself that gave her the space to be who she really was, without the pressure of appearing invincible. She looked at him, searching for the right words. "I'm handling everything the way I always have," she began, choosing her words carefully. "But you made me think about some things yesterday, and I hate admitting that." Ethan smiled slightly, recognizing that despite her serious tone, Chloe was beginning to open a door she usually kept closed to everyone. "That wasn't my intention, to bother you. I just wanted you to consider that there's more to you than just this." "I know there is," she replied, almost in a whisper. "But I've spent so much time dedicating myself to this part of my life, the work, the control over everything, that I don't know if I still know how to be any other way." Ethan watched her closely, his gaze patient. He understood that this was an internal battle Chloe had been fighting long before they had met. And though he wanted to help her see other possibilities, he knew it couldn't be forced. Chloe had to find the answers on her own. "I understand. But the thing is, you don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "No one is asking you to give up anything you've built. I just think, maybe, it's time to discover what else you want." Chloe was silent for a few moments, taking in his words. It was strange hearing someone talk to her like that. No one had ever suggested she might want more than she already had, that she could allow herself to desire something beyond professional success. It had always been about winning, about being the best. But now, with Ethan sitting across from her, she allowed herself to consider, if only for a moment, that maybe there was something more. Something she had ignored out of fear of losing control. "I don't know what that would even be," she admitted, her voice low, almost vulnerable. "I don't know what else I could want." Ethan smiled softly. "You don't have to figure that out now. It can be a process. And, in the meantime, I'll be around if you need me." Chloe felt a slight pressure in her chest at those words. It was rare for anyone to offer themselves like that, without asking for anything in return. Ethan wasn't there to take anything from her, or to manipulate the situation for his own gain. He was simply offering support, something she didn't know how to receive. Before she could respond, Ethan stood up, sensing that the conversation had been long enough for her to process. "I'll leave you alone now," he said softly, "but let me know if you need anything." Chloe watched him walk to the door, her mind still racing with everything they had discussed. Just as he was about to leave, she called out, "Ethan." He turned, his hand on the doorknob, and looked at her, waiting. "Thank you," she said sincerely. It wasn't easy for Chloe to express gratitude, but at that moment, it felt like the only thing she could say. Ethan smiled again, a smile full of understanding, and nodded before leaving. Chloe sat in the silent room for a few more minutes, the city lights blinking outside, as her emotions and thoughts slowly settled. For the first time in a long time, she felt that there might be something beyond work, beyond control, that she needed to explore something that lay beyond her limited vision of what was important. When she finally decided it was time to go home, Chloe gathered her things and left Miller Corp, but with a different feeling. It wasn't the end of her battles, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a new way of facing them. Over the weekend, Chloe tried something rare for her. She disconnected from work. Normally, she was always ahead of the reports, shareholders, and critical decisions at Miller Corp. However, after her conversation with Ethan, a seed of doubt began to take root in her mind. She allowed herself to sleep in a bit on Saturday, something she never did, and instead of reviewing contracts or preparing for the coming week, she decided to walk around the city. Washington was vibrant that morning. The autumn air carried a light breeze, and the trees lining the streets were beginning to exchange their green leaves for shades of yellow and red. Chloe, dressed in a light jacket and comfortable shoes in notable contrast to her usual professional attire, wandered without a set destination. Every step she took felt like a small rebellion against the frantic pace she imposed on herself daily. As she walked through the tree-lined neighborhoods, Chloe felt more connected to the present moment than she had in a long time. There were no commitments to meet, no expectations to manage. It was just her, the distant hum of cars, and the soft murmur of unknown voices around her. For the first time in a while, her mind wasn't entirely focused on work, and she found herself contemplating things she usually ignored. What did she enjoy outside the office? When was the last time she had genuinely had fun without considering how it would affect her career? These questions lingered in the air, and although they were uncomfortable, she knew they were necessary. After walking for over an hour, Chloe stumbled upon a small park she hadn't even known existed, tucked between two classic-style buildings. Children played on the swings, couples sat talking on benches beneath trees, and elderly people played chess at stone tables. The simplicity of the scene caught her off guard. She sat on an empty bench, observing the life around her, not needing to be part of it, but curious enough to want to understand it. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, pulling her out of her contemplation. She took it out, expecting another work-related message or an urgent email, but it was a message from Ethan. "How's the weekend going? Hope you've managed to relax a bit." Chloe sighed, feeling a mix of relief and discomfort. The message was simple, but it reminded her that someone in her life now seemed genuinely interested in her well-being. That was new for her. Ethan's constant presence was starting to stir things inside her that she hadn't expected. He wasn't part of her life out of obligation or interest. He was just there, consistently offering companionship she hadn't realized she needed. She stared at the message for a while, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to maintain the professional distance and respond with the same formality she used with everyone, but another part, the one that was allowing herself to lower her guard, wanted to be honest. In the end, she opted for something in between. "I'm trying, walking around the city a bit. What about you?" His reply came quickly. "Doing the same. Actually, I like to walk around when the hospital gives me a break. Clears my mind." Chloe smiled involuntarily. It was funny to think that, despite their lives being so different, they both found some kind of peace in the same simple activity, walking aimlessly, just absorbing their surroundings. She leaned back on the bench, feeling more connected to him, even from a distance. "You should have told me before you went out," Ethan messaged soon after. "We could have walked together." Chloe laughed quietly to herself, imagining how strange that idea would have seemed to her just a few weeks ago. Walking with someone, with no purpose, no agenda. It seemed almost absurd, but now, it felt more like an offer of companionship, something she was beginning to appreciate, albeit reluctantly. "Maybe next time," she replied, keeping the tone light, but without dismissing the idea. The weekend passed without any major surprises, and Chloe found herself in a constant state of reflection, oscillating between her personal life and the control she so cherished in her career. Ethan had planted something within her, a seed of uncertainty that was growing slowly but steadily. And although she didn't yet know where it would lead her, she began to accept that perhaps it was time to stop fighting these changes. When Monday arrived, the usual pace at Miller Corp resumed. Meetings with investors, reviewing strategies, and making new decisions to keep the company on top. Chloe was back to doing what she did best, but something had subtly shifted inside her. She was no longer fully immersed in the role of CEO as before. Part of her now observed from the outside, as if analyzing herself. During a meeting with the finance committee, where her uncle Robert was present, Chloe noticed something curious. Robert interrupted her several times, as he usually did, always trying to steer the conversation toward his own leadership ideas. Normally, this would deeply irritate her, and she would have snapped back with a sharp retort, reaffirming her absolute control over the company. But that morning, Chloe simply watched. She let him talk, let his ideas flow, without immediately contesting. Instead, she listened. Robert's behavior was predictable. His hunger for power was obvious. Yet, for the first time, Chloe saw beyond that. He was trying to destabilize her, yes, but his desperation was clear. His insistence on interfering was almost a confession of weakness. He needed an opening to feel relevant. And at that moment, Chloe realized she didn't need to fight him the usual way. At the end of the meeting, as everyone filed out, Robert lingered for a few seconds, organizing his papers with calculated calm. Chloe approached, gathering her own materials. But before leaving, she looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and coldness. "You know, it doesn't matter what you try, Robert. In the end, the board and the investors are on my side. They always have been." Robert looked up, surprised by Chloe's calm tone. He had expected an aggressive response, a direct attack, but instead, he found a serenity in her that he didn't recognize. "Chloe, I just want to ensure the company continues to prosper," he replied with a false smile. "There's nothing wrong with delegating, with sharing the burden." She gave him a small, emotionless smile. "I delegate enough. The rest I control, and you know that." Without waiting for a response, Chloe walked out, leaving Robert frustrated. He knew his maneuvers were failing, but he hadn't counted on Chloe's new approach, one born from a newfound confidence in herself that went beyond corporate control. She no longer needed to prove to him or anyone else that she was in charge. It was obvious, and for the first time, Chloe felt that she had nothing to fear. She wasn't alone on this battlefield anymore. Throughout the week, Chloe maintained her routine, but something had subtly shifted within her. Ethan's words, his constant presence, and the quiet battle with Robert echoed inside her in ways she couldn't ignore. During meetings, she felt less tense, as if part of her had been relieved of an invisible burden. The constant need to prove herself to the board, to her mother, to Robert was beginning to fade. Chloe was still ambitious, still driven by the desire for success, but a new perspective was slowly forming within her. She spent her days focused, as always, but now there were moments when her mind wandered. Every so often, she caught herself looking out the window, observing the city below, and wondering what else existed beyond the controlled world she had built. For so many years, Chloe had seen her career as the only measure of value that truly mattered. But with the recent conversations with Ethan and her own reflections, she began to question if she had allowed herself to be limited. One Thursday afternoon, Chloe received a message from Ethan in the middle of a meeting. She quickly glanced at her phone, something she rarely did, but seeing his name made her pause for a second. "I have an idea for you. How about a weekend away from Washington?" The idea caught her off guard. She rarely left the city, and entire weekends off were almost unthinkable. Her mind instinctively began listing all the reasons why it wouldn't be possible. Meetings, reports, responsibilities. But at the same time, the proposal was intriguing, like a small window of escape she hadn't realized she needed. Still, she hesitated. Disconnecting from everything, even for a short period, was something she hadn't done since taking the reins at Miller Corp. The idea of spending a weekend away from the pressures and expectations seemed as distant as it was unattainable. When the meeting ended, Chloe picked up her phone and stared at Ethan's message, thinking about how to respond. Finally, she decided to be honest. "I'm not sure I can. There's too much to do here." Ethan's response came almost instantly. "I know you're always busy, but maybe that's exactly why you need to go." Chloe read and reread the message. He was right, of course. Ethan had a way of always knowing what to say, of touching on the right points, and that bothered her a little. She was used to being the one in control, the one making all the decisions, but with him, there was a softness, a lightness that made her rethink everything. The simple idea of spending a weekend away, without the pressures of work and family, was something that both scared and attracted her. Still, the indecision gnawed at her. She stood from her desk, walked to the window of her office, and looked down at the city, where the intense traffic and frenetic pace of Washington continued uninterrupted. Part of her told her to continue, as she always had to prioritize work, leave everything else aside. But another part, a quieter part, but now impossible to ignore, encouraged her to do something different, to break free from the routine that was suffocating her. Suddenly, she made a decision. Okay, where do you have in mind? Ethan's response arrived in seconds, as if he had been waiting. There's a quiet place in the mountains, a few hours from here. Nothing fancy, but it's perfect for disconnecting. Chloe smiled slightly, imagining what he had in mind. She had never been the type to travel to disconnect. Her trips usually involved luxury hotels, meetings with investors, elegant dinners, and endless commitments. The concept of escaping to the mountains seemed so far removed from her reality that it almost felt surreal. Still, she accepted. When do we leave? Ethan responded right away. Friday night, if you can. I'll be ready. Chloe nodded to herself, already thinking about what she needed to organize at the office to ensure her absence over the weekend wouldn't be an issue. There was still a part of her that resisted the idea of leaving work behind, but the decision had been made. She knew she needed this break, even if she hesitated to admit it to herself. On Friday, as the end of the workday approached, Chloe finished the last tasks of the day with unusual efficiency. She informed her assistant that she would be gone until Sunday and gave the necessary instructions to keep everything in order. She still felt a slight discomfort at the thought of being away from the company for 2 days, but the anticipation of something new pushed her forward. Ethan picked her up at her apartment shortly after 6 in the evening. He was driving a simple SUV, something that seemed perfectly suited for the trip they were about to take. Chloe, usually accustomed to private drivers and luxury cars, found the rustic comfort of the vehicle strange, but she didn't complain. As she got into the car, she felt strangely relaxed, as if the trip had already begun to dissolve the tensions of the day. The journey began in silence, with both of them absorbing the change of scenery. As they left Washington behind, the roads grew narrower, and the tall buildings gave way to trees and open fields. Chloe watched the landscape with curiosity, feeling more and more distant from her usual life with every mile. Ethan, at the wheel, seemed at ease. He didn't force conversation, and Chloe appreciated that. For much of the drive, she remained quiet, simply looking out the window and enjoying the rare feeling of having nothing urgent to do. Ethan's calm seemed to be rubbing off on her, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to just be present in the moment. After a few hours on the road, the sun had already set, and the starry sky stretched across the horizon when Ethan finally turned onto a dirt road leading to a small cabin surrounded by towering trees. Chloe looked out the window, taking in the simplicity of the place. It was the complete opposite of the luxury and sophistication that usually surrounded her, but there was something comforting about the rustic nature of the cabin. It seemed like the kind of place where time moved differently, without the constant urgency that defined her life in Washington. "We're here," Ethan said, turning off the engine and getting out of the car. Chloe stepped out soon after, taking a deep breath of the mountain air. There was an almost absolute silence around them, broken only by the sound of leaves rustling gently in the breeze. She looked around, taking in the surroundings, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly far from everything. Far from work, from pressures, from expectations. Here, in this isolated place, it was as if the corporate world she commanded didn't exist. Ethan opened the door to the cabin and turned on the lights. The interior was simple but cozy, with wooden furniture, a fireplace in the corner, and a small but functional kitchen. Chloe stepped inside, still a bit hesitant, but starting to feel more comfortable. "There's nothing fancy here," Ethan said, as he took off his jacket and hung it on a hook by the door. "But it's quiet, and I thought you might like a break." Chloe smiled slightly, feeling grateful that he had thought of this. "It's different from everything I'm used to, but I think it's exactly what I need." Ethan smiled back, pleased with her response. "Good. Now, how about something to eat? I've got some things in the kitchen." Chloe settled onto the sofa, watching as he started preparing something simple. The soft sound of plates and utensils being handled in the kitchen contrasted with the quiet outside, and Chloe realized she was enjoying the feeling. It was so different from her daily routine that it almost felt like another life. As Ethan cooked, Chloe allowed herself to fully relax, something she rarely did. She closed her eyes for a few moments, listening to the crackling of the fireplace and the soft sounds of the forest outside. For the first time in a long time, there was no pressure, no expectations, just the present moment. And for once, that seemed enough. Night had fully fallen as Ethan prepared dinner in the small cabin kitchen. Chloe, sitting on the couch by the fireplace, felt the comforting warmth of the fire and the soft aroma of herbs coming from the kitchen. She watched Ethan in silence, appreciating the simplicity of the moment. There were no urgencies, no deadlines, just the sound of a knife, slicing ingredients, and the gentle crackling of the flames. It felt strange for Chloe to be so at ease without the weight of the responsibilities she was accustomed to. In that cabin, far from the hustle of Washington and the absolute control she held over her professional life, Chloe was experiencing something new, the absence of pressure. Her body and mind, always running at an accelerated pace, were beginning to slow down, allowing her to simply exist in that space without worrying about the next move. Ethan, while cooking, seemed at peace as well. He worked with a quiet precision, as if he were used to this kind of simplicity. The way he moved around the kitchen, with confidence and ease, made Chloe think about how different their lives were. He dealt daily with life and death, with decisions that directly impacted the fate of his patients. But here, in the mountains, he was completely disconnected from that burden, something Chloe deeply envied. When Ethan finally placed dinner on the table, a simple dish of pasta and grilled vegetables, he called Chloe, who got up and walked over to him slowly, still absorbing the calmness of the place. The table was set with wooden utensils and rustic plates, but there was an elegance in the simplicity of the arrangement. Chloe smiled slightly as she sat down, mentally thanking him for the temporary escape from her controlled life. "You make this seem easy," she commented, picking up the fork and looking at the plate before her. "It's because it isn't complicated," Ethan replied with a calm smile. "Sometimes the simplest things are what help us disconnect the most. I always come here when I feel like I need to disconnect from the hospital, the patients, everything." Chloe nodded, thinking about his words. Disconnecting was a concept she rarely practiced. Even when she was at home, her mind was always racing, always planning, solving problems that hadn't even arisen yet. But here, with Ethan, she was learning that perhaps it was possible to stop. Just stop. They ate in a comfortable silence, exchanging small comments about the food or the surroundings. The cabin seemed to isolate the two of them from any concerns, as if they were in a parallel universe where nothing could reach them. For Chloe, this sense of isolation was both strange and seductive. For so long, she had been used to being in control of everything: the company, her image, her relationships, that allowing herself to step out of that position felt liberating, but also terrifying. After dinner, Ethan suggested a walk under the stars. Chloe hesitated for a moment, but something inside her, perhaps the part of her that longed for something new, encouraged her to accept. She put on a jacket and followed Ethan outside the cabin, where the night sky was clear, filled with stars shining above them. The temperature had dropped a bit, and the fresh mountain air made her take a deep breath, as if each inhale purified her mind. They walked in silence along a trail that led into the forest, the sound of their steps muffled by dry leaves scattered on the ground. Around them, only the soft wind in the trees and the distant sound of a stream accompanied them. Chloe looked up, admiring the immense sky, feeling small under the vastness of so many stars. In Washington, the city lights always obscured this kind of view, but here, in the mountains, the sky seemed like an endless tapestry of twinkling lights. Ethan walked beside her, silently, but there was no discomfort in that. Chloe appreciated the fact that he didn't feel obligated to fill the moments with conversation. He respected the silence, something few people in her life did. People around her were always trying to impress her, forcing interactions, or creating situations to seem interesting. But with Ethan, everything was simple, straightforward, and that helped her relax. After a few minutes, They reached a clearing where a large rock was strategically placed, offering a panoramic view of the mountains and the valley below. Ethan climbed the rock with ease, extending a hand to help Chloe. She accepted the gesture, climbing up beside him. They sat side by side, gazing at the horizon lit only by the moon and stars. "I rarely see this," Chloe said, looking at the sky. "In the city, you forget how big the world is. It feels like everything revolves around buildings and meetings." Ethan glanced at her, a slight smile on his lips. "Maybe that's why you needed to see it now." She remained silent, absorbing his words. He was right. The vastness in front of her, the comforting silence of the mountains, were reminders that there was more to the world than the frenetic pace of Washington. Chloe felt small, but not in a negative way. Feeling small, here, meant she could finally allow herself not to be the center of everything. For a brief moment, she could let the world keep turning without her intervention. "You seem different," Ethan said after a few minutes, breaking the silence. Chloe turned to him, curious. "Different how?" "More at ease. When I first met you, it felt like you were always ready for the next battle, like you could never rest. But here, it seems like you're finally letting yourself take a break." Chloe thought about that. It was true. She had always been in combat mode, always on high alert, ready to deal with any obstacle that arose. But here, in this clearing, under the starry sky and far from all the conflicts, she felt a peace she didn't know was possible. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax, not as a tactic to recharge her energy, but as a genuine moment of rest. "Maybe I'm changing," she said finally, with a small smile. "Or maybe I just need more moments like this." Ethan chuckled softly, nodding. "Maybe both." They sat on the rock for a few more minutes, with no hurry to return. The cool breeze caressed their faces, and Chloe closed her eyes for a moment, simply listening to the sounds of nature around them. Every detail of that night seemed to etch itself into her memory as something she knew she'd need to remember in the future. The feeling of the wind, the sound of the leaves, the quiet presence of Ethan beside her. It felt like she was recharging in a completely new way. When they finally decided to return, the walk back to the cabin was filled with the same comfortable silence. Chloe felt strangely light, as if something inside her was slowly being transformed. It wasn't an abrupt change, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift that was beginning to redefine how she saw the world around her. Back at the cabin, Ethan lit the fire in the fireplace, and they settled onto the couch, both relaxed. Chloe pulled a blanket over herself, feeling the warmth of the fire against her feet. Ethan, beside her, picked up a book from a shelf and began flipping through it, though he didn't seem truly focused. "Thank you for bringing me here," Chloe said after a long silence. "I didn't know I needed this." Ethan looked at her, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the fire. "I knew you needed it. I just thought it might take you longer to realize it." She smiled, genuinely grateful for his presence. Ethan had helped her see a side of herself that she had ignored for so long. Here, far from everything that pressured her, Chloe was beginning to reconnect with parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of expectations and responsibilities. And while she knew that the real world would be waiting when she returned to Washington, she now knew there was something more, something she could carry with her, even when she was back in the chaos. The next morning, soft sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of the cabin, bathing the space in a gentle glow. Chloe woke up slowly, feeling more refreshed than she had in weeks. It was rare for her to wake without the sound of an alarm, without the day's agenda already running through her mind. There, in the secluded cabin, time seemed to stretch, offering her a sense of freedom she seldom experienced. Ethan was already outside, gathering firewood. Chloe watched him through the window as he worked, his movements calm and methodical. His serenity had always intrigued her. Ethan seemed to carry a lightness, even with the weight of his responsibilities. She wondered if she would ever feel that kind of peace with the rhythm of life. Part of her knew she was still far from it, but just considering the possibility felt like progress. After a few minutes, she decided to get out of bed and join him. She put on a comfortable sweater, ran her fingers through her tousled hair, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The light, crisp breeze woke her further as she walked toward Ethan, who was stacking the wood beside the cabin. "Good morning," he said with a gentle smile, not surprised to see her. "Good morning," Chloe replied, pulling her sweater tighter against the wind that bit at her skin. "Do you always wake up this early?" Ethan chuckled softly, picking up another piece of wood. "Hospital habits. There's always something to do, and I like to make the most of the early morning. Everything feels calmer." Chloe nodded, understanding. The concept of starting the day without urgency was new to her. Her mornings in Washington were a race against time, a series of meetings and decisions to be made before she even finished her coffee. But here, she realized time moved differently. The hours weren't consumed by pressure, but extended by a calm she was beginning to appreciate. "And you?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. "How did you sleep without the noise of Washington?" Chloe smiled slightly, crossing her arms as she looked at the landscape around them. "It was different, quiet in a way I didn't expect. I think I could get used to this." "I knew you would," Ethan said, satisfaction in his voice. He picked up the last piece of firewood and turned to her, his eyes full of a calmness Chloe was beginning to envy. "Sometimes, all we need is a little distance to see things more clearly." Chloe remained silent, reflecting on his words. She knew that when she returned to Washington, the chaos of corporate life awaited her. Robert would still be there, pushing for more control. Investors would continue to demand results, and her mother would not stop reminding her of family expectations. But now, after these few days in the mountains, Chloe felt a little more prepared to handle it. Throughout the morning, they settled in the kitchen for a simple but comforting breakfast. As they ate, Chloe noticed how the environment reinforced the idea that life didn't have to be lived in constant haste. She was beginning to understand what Ethan meant about disconnecting. The world would keep turning without her, and that was okay. After breakfast, Ethan suggested another walk. Chloe hesitated for a moment, thinking about the many times she had rejected such proposals, believing that walking without a clear purpose was a waste of time. But something had changed inside her since the night before, and now, the simple act of walking without rush seemed like an opportunity to explore something new or even herself. They followed a trail that wound through the forest behind the cabin. The trees were tall, their leaves beginning to take on the orange and red hues of autumn. Chloe listened to the soft crunch of dry leaves underfoot, mixed with the occasional birdsong hidden among the branches. There were no car horns, no distant sirens, just the sounds of nature and the quiet presence of Ethan beside her. "Did you always know you wanted to be a doctor?" Chloe asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her for a moment, thinking before answering. "Not really. When I was younger, I wanted to be an engineer like my dad. But something changed when I was in high school. I had a strong experience with a doctor who took care of my sister, and it stayed with me. I realized I wanted to make a difference in people's lives, and medicine felt like the right path." Chloe listened intently, absorbing every word. It was rare for her to have this kind of conversation, one in which she could get to know someone beyond the surface. "You seem so at peace with your choice," she commented. "Like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Ethan shrugged, but his gaze was serious. "I love what I do, but I also know it's easy to lose yourself in it. I've had moments when I thought about quitting, when the weight of the decisions felt like too much. That's why I come here, to remind myself who I am outside of the hospital." Chloe reflected on that. She had never thought of herself outside of Miller Corp. What would she be if not the CEO? Who was Chloe beyond the goals, the numbers, the strategies? It was a question that unsettled her, but also one she was beginning to realize she needed to answer, no matter how difficult. "Have you ever thought about doing something else?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Ethan smiled slightly, though there was a seriousness behind it. "I think everyone thinks about that at some point. But the truth is, even with all the challenges, I can't see myself doing anything else. I think I've found my place, but that doesn't mean I don't need breaks. Even for someone who loves what they do, sometimes you have to stop and breathe." Chloe nodded, taking in his words. Breaks. It was something she avoided at all costs. Ever since she had taken over Miller Corp, her life had been a non-stop sequence of challenges and goals, with no room to breathe. But now, as she walked through the forest with Ethan, she felt for the first time that maybe she needed more than just professional success. Maybe she needed to figure out what it meant to live beyond work. Later, back at the cabin, Chloe sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the horizon as the sun slowly began to set. Ethan was inside, preparing dinner, and the sound of his activities in the kitchen was a comforting reminder that, despite their differences, they shared something special. He had shown her a world she hadn't known, and Chloe knew that this experience in the mountains would change her, one way or another. The sun began to disappear, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Chloe felt a strange sense of gratitude, not just for Ethan and the peace of the place, but for allowing herself this pause. Something inside her was starting to rearrange, as if life, suddenly, was more than just a series of achievements and challenges. Ethan came out to join her on the porch, sitting beside her in silence. They sat there, watching the sunset together, without needing to fill the moment with words. For Chloe, this was true rest, the presence of someone who didn't demand anything beyond what she was already willing to offer. She knew that when she returned to the city, things wouldn't be easy. But now, with Ethan by her side, she felt like she could handle everything in a different way. On Sunday morning, Chloe woke to the sound of birds and the gentle touch of sunlight filtering through the cabin's window. She stretched, feeling her muscles relaxed in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. The tranquility of the place, combined with the peaceful days that had passed, was already having an effect. For the first time in years, she didn't wake with a sense of urgency or the pressure of responsibilities immediately occupying her mind. It was a strange but welcome sensation. She went downstairs and found Ethan in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft aroma of scrambled eggs and toast. Ethan smiled as she entered. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" Chloe nodded, sitting at the wooden table and watching as he finished cooking. "Very well. Actually, I think I'm starting to understand what you meant about needing a break." Ethan placed a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down beside her, his face reflecting the quiet satisfaction he always seemed to carry. "I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes, you need to step away from everything to realize you don't have to carry the world on your shoulders all the time." Chloe took a sip of the coffee, feeling its warmth wake her fully. "It's strange to think about, but it makes sense. I've spent so much time chasing results, trying to prove myself, that I forgot about myself in the process." Ethan watched her for a moment, as if contemplating his next words. He seemed to understand exactly what she was feeling, but knew that Chloe needed to find her own way to this realization. "You've been doing that your whole life, Chloe. But the most important thing to understand is that even when you take a break, what you've built is still there. You don't lose anything by pausing." Chloe remained quiet, reflecting on that. For so long, she had linked her worth to what she accomplished. To her, stopping always seemed like a risk, as if it meant losing ground. But slowly, she was beginning to understand that this wasn't true. The world wouldn't fall apart if she took time for herself. And perhaps, by allowing herself to breathe, she could return even stronger. After breakfast, Ethan suggested one last walk before they returned to Washington. Chloe agreed without hesitation. They walked along a different path from the day before, which led to a small lake hidden among the trees. The water reflected the blue sky above, creating a breathtaking view. Chloe stopped at the edge of the lake, absorbing the silence and the simple beauty of the place. "This is unbelievable," she remarked, looking at the still surface of the water. "In the city, everything is movement, noise. Here it's like time stands still." Ethan smiled, standing beside her. "That's why I love coming here. It reminds me that not everything in life has to be rushed." They stood side by side in silence for a few more minutes, just listening to the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional distant call of an animal. Chloe allowed herself to relax, letting go of the remaining tension in her body. "When we go back," she said suddenly, her voice softly breaking the quiet, "do you think I'll be able to take this feeling with me? This sense of calm?" Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with understanding. "I think you can, but it's a choice you'll have to make every day. The world will keep trying to pull you back into its frantic pace, but if you remember moments like this, you can find balance." Chloe looked at him, feeling the truth in his words. She knew that life in Washington wouldn't magically change because of this experience. There would still be meetings, tough decisions, and the constant pressure of maintaining her leadership at Miller Corp. But now, with this new perspective, she believed she could face those challenges differently, with more balance. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they decided to head back to the cabin and prepare for the drive home. Chloe felt renewed, but she also knew that returning to the city would bring new challenges. There was still much to resolve with Robert, the board, and the investors. But now, she felt more secure in herself, not just as the relentless CEO everyone knew, but also as a woman discovering that there was more to her life than work. The drive back to Washington was peaceful. Ethan drove with the same calmness as before, while Chloe gazed out the window, watching the scenery pass by quickly. She knew this weekend had been a turning point. The changes inside her were subtle, but real. She felt lighter, more present, as if something within her had been realigned. As they entered the city, the traffic began to pick up, and Chloe felt the familiar buzz of Washington approaching. Ethan glanced at her, sensing the change in the environment, but said nothing. He knew Chloe was returning to a world that would always demand a lot from her, but he trusted that she was more prepared now. When they reached Chloe's apartment, he parked the car and looked at her with a gentle smile. "It was an interesting weekend," he remarked, turning off the engine. Chloe smiled back, feeling warmth in her chest. "It was more than interesting. I think it was what I needed." They sat in silence for a moment, exchanging looks that said more than words could. There was a growing connection between them, something deeper than just the contract that had brought them together. Chloe knew that. Ethan had become an important presence in her life, someone who helped her see things more clearly. "Thank you for this, Ethan," Chloe said softly. "I don't know if I would have done this on my own." "You would have," he replied with confident ease. "You just needed a little nudge." Chloe stepped out of the car and turned to him before entering her building. "See you tomorrow?" "Of course," he replied. "See you tomorrow, Chloe." She gave him a small wave and entered her apartment, feeling strangely at peace despite knowing that the world outside hadn't changed. What had changed, however, was her. The woman walking into that apartment now was different from the one who had left 2 days earlier. She knew that the fight with Robert and the board was still ahead, and that her position at Miller Corp would continue to be a challenge. But now, Chloe had a new perspective, a strength she hadn't realized existed. On Monday morning, Chloe walked into the Miller Corp building with a renewed sense of purpose. The heavy traffic and the packed schedule no longer fazed her like they used to. There was a lightness in her step, a quiet confidence that didn't come from needing to prove anything to anyone, but from an internal peace she was beginning to discover. When she entered her office, she noticed an envelope on her desk. It was from the finance team, detailing the upcoming meetings with investors and the board. Chloe picked it up, but instead of opening it immediately, she set it aside and looked out the window of her office. The city was bustling, as always, but for the first time, she felt no need to rush to keep up with its pace. She was still Chloe Miller, the relentless CEO of Miller Corp, but now there was more to her than just that. She took a deep breath, feeling the tranquility of the mountains still alive in her chest. No matter what came next, she knew she could handle it. Ethan had been right. There was no need to carry the world on her shoulders all the time. And with that new mindset, Chloe was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. On Monday, Chloe's return to the routine at Miller Corp was as abrupt as expected. The mornings in Washington offered none of the respite of the mountains. All her responsibilities were waiting for her, as if the pause had never happened. Meetings with the board, contract reviews, and the inevitable maneuvers from Robert to undermine her leadership were just some of the items on her already packed agenda. Still, Chloe felt different. As she entered the Miller Corp building, the same place she associated with control and power, she noticed something subtly changed. The fast-paced rhythm of the city, which used to guide her, now felt like a distant noise. Of course, she was still the CEO, still needed to make important decisions and keep the company running efficiently. But somehow, the weight of those responsibilities felt lighter. Early in the morning, she ran into Robert in the elevator, an encounter that would have normally created immediate tension. He looked at her with that calculated smile she knew so well and didn't waste time starting. "Chloe, do you have a few minutes after the meeting? We need to discuss a pending financial issue." She knew exactly what he was trying to do. Robert always chose strategic moments to approach her, as if testing her, gauging her reaction before trying to influence any major decision. In the past, this approach would have irritated her. She would have prepared for yet another veiled confrontation. But this time, Chloe smiled calmly. "Of course, Robert. We can talk after. I'll be in my office." Her confident, composed smile seemed to disarm Robert for a moment. He had expected resistance, as was usual, but something about her demeanor made him hesitate, even if only briefly. She noticed this and knew, internally, that her new approach was working. In the past, Robert would have been able to plant a seed of doubt or irritation in her mind, but now, she wasn't willing to be swayed by him. The board meeting went as expected, long, with various agendas and heated discussions about the company's direction. As usual, Robert made it a point to suggest that some of Chloe's strategies were going in the wrong direction. He hinted that priorities were misaligned and that perhaps it was time to rethink certain investment decisions. Some board members seemed uncertain, but Chloe remained calm, unshaken by the undercurrents of doubt. When it was her turn to speak, she responded confidently, articulating her points clearly and showing the results she had achieved over the past few months. She didn't defend herself aggressively, but with facts and data. The composed way she presented her arguments gave the board the impression that she was firmly in control, leaving no room for Robert to create divisions. By the end of the meeting, some board members agreed with Chloe's suggestions, while others, clearly swayed by Robert, remained neutral. Still, she knew she had retained the trust of the majority, and that was enough. More importantly, she realized that the battle with Robert didn't have to be a constant fight. He could try to interfere, but she didn't need to engage with him in the traditional way. Chloe had learned the importance of choosing her battles, a lesson she now carried with her. After the meeting, Chloe returned to her office, expecting the inevitable conversation with Robert. She reviewed a few emails while she waited, but felt calm, as if the outcome of that meeting was already clear to her. Robert entered shortly after, with his usual serious expression, his eyes trying to read every move of his niece. So he began, sitting in a chair across from Chloe's desk, about that financial issue. "I really think we need to reconsider the resource allocation for the expansion project. The investors aren't fully convinced this is the right direction." Chloe watched him, noticing how carefully he chose each word. Robert always played on uncertainties, trying to plant doubts, and then influence decisions based on those doubts. But this time, Chloe wouldn't react with her usual defensiveness. "I understand your concern, Robert, but the data is on our side. The expansion project has already shown signs of growth in the markets we're exploring. We have the reports to prove it." She handed him some documents across the table, her eyes steady on his. Robert took the papers but didn't look at them right away. "Yes, of course, but in the long term, those markets are still volatile. What if the strategy fails?" Chloe maintained her steady gaze, but her tone remained calm. "Business always involves risk, but I don't make decisions based on what-ifs. I base my choices on facts, grounded projections, and analyses. That's how I've always operated, and that's what has brought us this far." For a moment, there was silence. Robert seemed ready to say something more, but Chloe could tell he was struggling to find a flaw in her reasoning. She waited, not rushing to fill the silence, a new lesson she'd learned. Not every response needs to be immediate. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. Finally, Robert sighed, a rare gesture from him. "All right, Chloe, let's see how this develops." He stood up and, before leaving, gave her one last look. "I just hope you know what you're doing." "I do," Chloe responded, without hesitation. As he left, Chloe felt an unusual sense of relief, not the kind that comes from winning an argument, but something deeper, as if she had proven to herself that constant battles weren't necessary to maintain her position. She was confident in her decisions and abilities. Ethan had been right. She didn't need to carry the world on her shoulders all the time. Later that day, as she reviewed a few final documents before heading home, Chloe received a message from Ethan. "Dinner tonight?" She smiled as she read the message. Ethan had become a constant presence in her life, but in a way she hadn't expected. He didn't demand anything, didn't pressure her, he was just there. It was comforting to know that he was a sort of anchor amid the storm she still faced. Chloe picked up her phone and responded, "Yes. Can I choose the place this time?" Ethan's response came quickly, as usual. "Of Of course. I'll let you surprise me. Chloe closed her laptop and got ready to leave. The day had been intense, but at the same time, she felt light, as if she were slowly discovering a new way to handle challenges. That evening, when she met Ethan for dinner, she wouldn't be the powerful CEO, always ready for a fight. She would just be Chloe, someone who was starting to realize that life could be more than just achievements and results. Later, when she met Ethan at a small, understated restaurant she used to avoid too simple for her once demanding taste, Chloe realized that simplicity was becoming more and more appealing. They talked about light things, leaving the city's problems and work aside for a few hours. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they had reached a new level of connection. It wasn't the contract that united them at that moment. It was something more, something she couldn't fully define yet, but it was there, growing between them. As the dinner ended and they walked through the quiet streets, Chloe realized she was changing. Slowly but steadily. The pressure still existed. The challenges hadn't disappeared, but she was more prepared to face them with a clear mind and a lighter heart. And although this journey was hers alone, it was comforting to know she had someone by her side, even if subtly. Tuesday morning in Washington dawned cloudy, with a thin layer of mist covering the tall buildings. Chloe woke up early, as usual, but instead of diving straight in her fast-paced routine, she lingered in bed for a while, reflecting on the past few days. The dinner with Ethan the night before had been another reminder that her life was transforming in unexpected ways. She was starting to find balance and feel that she no longer needed to be on high alert all the time. She got up calmly, made herself a coffee, and prepared for the day ahead. Deep down, she knew that there were still battles to face. Robert would continue pressing, the board would have its demands, and the company's future would always be in question. But the weight of these issues no longer felt as overwhelming as before. Chloe knew she could handle the difficulties without being consumed by them. Arriving at Miller Corp, Chloe found her assistant already organizing the first meetings of the day. Among them, there was an important meeting with a new group of investors interested in expanding the company's international operations. Such meetings usually put her on high alert, but this time, Chloe approached it differently prepared, yet without the usual anxiety that used to dominate her thoughts. As she entered the conference room, the investors were already waiting. There were 3 of them, all middle-aged men with serious expressions and calculating looks. Chloe had dealt with their type before. She knew they were there to test her leadership, to see if she was truly in control of the company she represented. Unlike how she would have acted weeks ago, Chloe didn't begin with a forceful speech or a data-heavy presentation. Instead, she opened with something lighter, establishing a direct and honest conversation about the company's direction. She presented the expansion plans clearly, highlighting not only numbers and forecasts but also the importance of long-term strategic vision. Rather than pushing for immediate growth, Chloe explained how each move was being carefully planned to ensure sustainability. The calmness with which she spoke wasn't just a tactic, it was a reflection of what she had been learning. Initially reserved, the investors gradually warmed up. Their questions shifted from immediate risks to future opportunities. Chloe felt she was guiding the conversation, not through force or imposition, but through confidence and balance. The meeting ended with smiles and firm handshakes, a clear sign of success. Not because she had won a debate or averted a crisis, but because she had earned their trust with serenity. After the meeting, Chloe returned to her office, feeling lighter. She knew there was still much work ahead, but the feeling of having handled a challenge without exhausting herself was new and refreshing. As she sat down, she noticed a message on her phone. It was from Ethan, as if he knew the perfect moment to reach out. "How'd the meeting go?" Chloe smiled and quickly replied, "Better than I expected. You're turning into my lucky charm." His response came almost immediately. "Or maybe you're just realizing you can be incredible without needing luck." She smiled again, feeling the warmth his words brought. Ethan, with his gentle and constant presence, had become a sort of safe harbor for her. He didn't need to be physically by her side all the time, but his influence was clear. Chloe was changing, and she knew part of that transformation came from the way he helped her see the world. The strength he brought, without being intrusive, was something she deeply admired. Just then, a soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant entered, looking slightly concerned. "Chloe, Robert is here." He's asking to speak with you about an emergency meeting he's scheduled for this afternoon. Chloe frowned. She hadn't been informed of any emergency meeting, and the way Robert always orchestrated these emergencies made her suspicious of his intentions. She knew he wouldn't give up easily on trying to undermine her position in the company, and this was just another one of his moves. But unlike before, Chloe didn't feel apprehensive. She mentally prepared herself and calmly replied to her assistant. "Tell him to come in." Robert appeared shortly after, wearing his usual air of superiority. Carrying a portfolio, he always used to give an air of formality to his schemes. He sat down in the chair across from Chloe's desk without waiting for an invitation, which didn't surprise her. "Chloe, we need to talk about the international expansion. I've been hearing some concerns from the investors. I think we should review a few points before moving forward." Chloe knew where this was heading. Robert always tried to stir up instability before major decisions. He enjoyed planting seeds of doubt, fostering insecurity so that he could later capitalize on it. But this time, Chloe was ready. "Robert, I just finished a meeting with investors, and things went very well. They're confident in our direction and our next steps. I don't think we need to review anything right now. But if there's something specific you'd like to discuss, I'm open to hearing it." Robert hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting such a direct response. He flipped through his portfolio, as if trying to find an argument to bolster his position. "Well, I'm not saying we should change everything, just that it's wise to be cautious." Chloe kept her gaze steady. "Caution is important, of course, but what we're doing isn't reckless. Every decision has been calculated, and so far, the results show that we're on the right track." Robert leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated by the lack of room to maneuver. "All right, Chloe, but I'll be watching this closely. I expect you to," Chloe replied with a slight smile. "Because so am I." With that, Robert stood up, somewhat irritated, but without the arguments to prolong the conversation. He left the room, leaving Chloe alone once again. In the past, this interaction would have left her unsettled, wondering about all the ways he might try to sabotage her plans. But now, she felt secure. She knew she was in control not because she needed to control every detail, but because she trusted herself and what she was building. A little later, as she organized her thoughts and documents, her phone buzzed again with a new message from Ethan. "Dinner again tonight? I have a feeling you'll need it." Chloe chuckled to herself. It was as if he had a radar for the tricky situation she faced. And somehow, even from afar, Ethan knew exactly when she needed a moment to breathe. She quickly typed back, "You're right, I definitely will, but I'm picking the restaurant this time." "Deal," Ethan replied, always with that same light tone that helped her unwind. "I'll let you surprise me." Chloe looked out the window of her office, watching the city's constant movement below. The day wasn't over yet, and she knew more challenges lay ahead. But with what she had recently learned, she knew she could face them without losing herself in the process. She was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone, not to Robert, not to the board. What mattered now was doing what needed to be done, with the confidence that she was on the right path. The dinner that night was unlike any other Chloe and Ethan had shared before. They met at a small yet elegant restaurant in a quieter part of the city. The atmosphere was understated, with low lighting and tables spaced far enough apart to create a sense of intimacy without encroaching on privacy. Chloe had chosen the place intentionally, wanting to escape the more popular corporate restaurants she usually frequented. Ethan was already seated when she arrived. He smiled as she approached, and Chloe felt a wave of calm that she was beginning to associate with his presence. As she walked toward the table, she realized that the dynamic between them had shifted significantly in recent weeks. The contract that once seemed like the only thing binding them was now a distant detail. What kept Ethan in her life was no longer obligation, but a connection that had developed naturally. "You picked a good one," Ethan said as she settled in. "This place is great. I don't think I would have come here on my own." Chloe smiled, pleased with his approval. "I wanted something quieter tonight. I think the week has already been hectic enough." Ethan nodded, picking up the menu and browsing through it casually. "Yeah, it seems like things at Miller Corp have been a bit tense lately." She sighed, knowing the topic would come up eventually. "Robert keeps playing his tricks. He called an emergency meeting today to try and throw off the expansion plan. But honestly, I think I'm getting used to his tactics. You seem to be handling it better," Ethan remarked, putting the menu down and studying her with interest. Before, this kind of thing seemed to weigh you down a lot more. Chloe took a sip of water, considering his words. You're right. I think I'm learning not to react to everything like it's a crisis. Robert will keep trying, and I know I can't control that, but I can control how I deal with him. And frankly, I'm not going to let his manipulations get to me anymore. Ethan smiled, visibly impressed with her progress. That's good to hear. You seem more grounded, more confident. Chloe reflected on that while the waiter came to take their orders. After they chose their food, the silence between them was not uncomfortable, but filled with a sense of anticipation. Chloe realized that, in the weeks they had been spending more time together, her relationship with Ethan had changed in a way she could no longer ignore. He was no longer just a convenient presence or contract partner. He was becoming someone important to her, in a way that was still difficult to fully define. And you? Chloe asked, smoothly shifting the subject. How are things at the hospital? Ethan relaxed further in his chair, crossing his arms with an easy smile. It's going well. Had a few tough surgeries this week, but nothing I'm not used to. The hospital can be intense, but sometimes I like that intensity. It's a constant reminder that we're doing something important. Chloe nodded, understanding what he meant. They shared that trait, the need for control in intense environments. But at the same time, she knew there was a fundamental difference between them. Despite dealing with life and death situations, Ethan carried a lightness that she had not yet mastered, and that drew her to him in a way she was beginning to recognize. Sometimes I wish I could be like that, Chloe admitted, her voice softer than usual. You seem to handle the heavy stuff so naturally. Like, even with all the responsibility, it doesn't consume you. Ethan looked at her with a gentle expression, his eyes attentive, as if he understood exactly what she was trying to convey. I used to be like you, he confessed, his voice low. Early in my career, I let the pressure consume me. Every mistake, every patient we couldn't save, felt like a personal failure. But over time, I learned that not everything is in my control. I do my best, but I know I can't carry the weight of it all. Chloe sat in silence, absorbing his words. She knew she was still far from achieving that kind of balance, but for the first time, she believed it was possible. Maybe that's what she needed to learn, to accept that not everything depended solely on her. Do you think I'll ever get there? She asked, revealing more vulnerability than she was used to showing. Ethan smiled, a smile full of understanding. I think you're already on your way, Chloe. You just need to keep letting yourself find your own rhythm. She looked away, feeling the weight of his words. The time she had spent in the mountains with Ethan had been a catalyst for this change. But now she knew the real challenge would be maintaining that balance as she returned to the corporate world and its constant pressures. Still, with Ethan by her side, she felt there was a new source of strength growing within her. The rest of the dinner continued light and relaxed, with occasional laughter and discussions about trivial matters. Chloe found herself surprised by how much she enjoyed being with him, how much she appreciated the simplicity of these moments. There were no strategic moves, no worries about image or power. She could just be herself, and that was rare for someone who lived constantly under the scrutiny of others. When they finished, Ethan suggested a walk through the quiet streets around the restaurant. The night air was fresh, and the city lights twinkled softly in the distance. Chloe agreed, in no hurry to return to her apartment. They walked side by side, talking about the city, their likes, and experiences like old friends who had known each other for years. The familiarity between them grew with each step. At one point, as they walked through a small, tree-lined square, Ethan stopped, looking up at the night sky. Chloe, curious, followed his gaze, but the stars were faint, obscured by the city lights. Yet the simple act of pausing, of just looking, made her smile. It was something she rarely did, just stop and look, without a clear purpose, without an agenda. Do you still think about work when you're not in the office? Ethan asked, turning to her. Chloe laughed, a low and honest sound. Always. It's hard to turn it off. Even in the quietest moments, my mind is always anticipating what might happen next. But lately I've been trying to change that. Ethan smiled sideways. I've noticed. You're doing it. Little by little. Chloe looked at him for a moment, and something in the air between them seemed to shift. The connection that had been growing so naturally now felt more tangible, more real. There was something unspoken, but felt, and Chloe knew, in that moment, that things between them were no longer just a comfortable friendship or a convenient arrangement. Without thinking too much, she took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Her eyes met his, and the intensity of that moment was enough to let her be carried away. Gently and almost instinctively, Chloe leaned in, and Ethan, without hesitation, welcomed her. The kiss that followed was natural, unhurried, but full of meanings that both of them understood. It wasn't the start of something new, but the continuation of something that had been happening for a while. When they pulled back, Chloe smiled, still feeling the lightness of the moment. Ethan, with the same calm smile as always, looked at her with tenderness. "Little steps," he repeated, in a playful tone but full of truth. Chloe laughed, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "Yes, little steps." They continued walking, as if nothing had changed, but both knew that, from that moment on, something had definitely shifted. The connection that had already existed between them now had a new depth, and Chloe, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to believe that she could balance everything: life, work, and even love in a way that once seemed impossible. The next morning, Chloe woke up with a light and strangely familiar feeling, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As she opened her eyes, the first thought that came to her was the night before. The kiss with Ethan, the relaxed walk through the streets of Washington, everything still felt present, like a recent memory that refused to fade. She stayed in bed for a few minutes, soaking in the morning's quiet and allowing herself to smile as she remembered Ethan's gentle touch, the natural way the moment had unfolded. But soon, reality pulled her back. Work, responsibilities, and the weight of what awaited her at the office. She couldn't lose herself in the lightness of that night for too long. There was still Miller Corp to manage, and the power games that never ceased. Robert, the board, the investors, all of it required her attention. But now, Chloe felt different, as if something inside her was stronger, more secure. Ethan hadn't transformed her life, but he was helping her see that she could be more than just the pressures she carried. After a quick shower and getting dressed for another day of work, Chloe left her apartment and walked to the office. The Washington sky was gray, heavy with clouds threatening rain, but she didn't mind. In fact, the city seemed to match her mood that morning, quiet and reflective, with a touch of anticipation in the air. When she entered the Miller Corp building, the familiar energy of the environment began to take over her senses. The anxious glances from her team, the murmurs in the hallways, the constant sound of phones and keyboards. She knew that day would bring challenges, and the first one was already waiting for her: Robert. As soon as she stepped into her office, Chloe found an urgent memo on her desk. Robert had called a meeting with the board to discuss strategic adjustments and leadership. The document wasn't clear, but Robert's intention was obvious. He was preparing another move, possibly trying to question Chloe's ability to lead the company. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and though she had known this moment would come, the intensity of the attack surprised her. In the past, this would have sparked immediate anxiety in Chloe. The feeling of being constantly challenged and tested kept her on edge, always ready to fight back against any insinuation that she wasn't capable. But today, as she looked at the memo, she didn't feel the same tension as before. Robert was predictable, and his strategy, no matter how aggressive, didn't intimidate her anymore. She knew what he was trying to do: question her control, hint that the expansion plan was out of her reach. But Chloe had confidence in what she was building. She spent the morning mentally preparing for the meeting. She gathered reports, reviewed financial data, and reevaluated every detail of the ongoing projects. But it wasn't just a technical preparation. It was emotional preparation. Chloe remembered Ethan's words, how he had said that not everything was always under control, and that was okay. With that perspective in mind, she prepared not just to counter Robert's attacks, but to show the board that her leadership wasn't questionable because it came from a place of internal confidence, not just strategy. When the afternoon arrived and she entered the meeting room, Robert was already there, sitting at the head of the table, chatting with a few board members. He seemed confident, almost relaxed, as if he was certain his plan would work. Chloe noticed that some of the board members looked serious, others visibly concerned. It was clear that Robert had spoken to them beforehand, trying to plant doubts. Chloe sat calmly in her seat, organizing her documents on the table. She waited for Robert to start, knowing he would take the initiative, as he always did. And, indeed, that's exactly what happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice always controlled and formal. "In recent months, Miller Corp has faced significant challenges, especially with the international expansion plan. While I acknowledge Chloe's effort as our CEO in maintaining growth, I believe we need to reconsider the feasibility of continuing in this direction. There are concerns about the financial impact and long-term sustainability. Perhaps it's time to review our approach." He spoke as though he were making a reasonable suggestion, but Chloe knew that behind his facade of concern, he wanted to weaken her in front of the board. Robert expected her to react defensively, maybe even aggressively. But instead, Chloe remained serene. When it was her turn to speak, she lifted her head, looked directly at the board members, and began. "I understand the concerns raised by Robert," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The international expansion plan involves risks, as any growth decision does. However, so far the results have been promising. The markets we are exploring are showing clear signs of potential. Our financial reports indicate that with the right strategies, we can not only stabilize but maximize our profits in these new territories." Chloe began handing out copies of the reports she had prepared, continuing to speak as the board members reviewed the documents. "What we have here is not a reckless gamble, but a calculated decision based on detailed analysis. Yes, we are facing risks, but we are prepared to address them. I believe that this is what sets us apart, the ability to innovate and grow without losing control." She paused, observing the reactions around the table. Some of the board members nodded, absorbing the information attentively. Others, like Robert, kept their expressions unreadable, but Chloe knew she was hitting her mark. She wasn't defending her plan with aggression, but with confidence. It was no longer about proving she had control. She knew she did. When she finished, the silence in the room was palpable. All eyes turned to Robert, waiting for his response. He hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting Chloe to respond with such composure. He flipped through the documents, trying to find a flaw, but there was nothing he could directly contest. Finally, Robert looked up and said, with a forced tone of cooperation, "It seems the numbers are in your favor, Chloe. We'll monitor it closely as always." Chloe simply nodded, not needing an explicit victory. She knew that, in that moment, she had reaffirmed her leadership in a way that Robert couldn't undermine. When the meeting ended, she left the room without looking back, feeling lighter than she had in months. Back in her office, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Ethan, as if he had sensed how things had unfolded. "How did it go? I bet you crushed it." Chloe laughed to herself, feeling the warmth of his words. She quickly replied, "Nothing I couldn't handle." "Dinner later?" Ethan replied almost instantly, "Of course. I'm at the hospital, but I'll meet you afterward." She put the phone away, looking out the office window at the city below. For the first time, she felt in control in a way that didn't rely on power games or aggressive strategies. It was a control that came from within, from a confidence she had found by allowing herself to be more than just the ruthless CEO everyone expected her to be. When she left Miller Corp that night, she felt at peace. She knew that, in the future, there would still be challenges. Robert wouldn't give up easily, the board would keep pressing, and the markets could bring surprises. But now, Chloe knew she didn't have to carry that burden alone. She had found balance. And more than that, she had found someone by her side who constantly reminded her of it. The week continued with its usual intensity, but something within Chloe had definitely changed. While the meetings piled up and challenges arose with the characteristic speed of Miller Corp, she remained steady, balanced. The board meeting had reaffirmed her position, and the ongoing confrontation with Robert, though always looming, no longer unsettled her in the same way. She knew he would continue his attempts to undermine her, but instead of seeing it as a constant battle, Chloe began to realize that real strength lay in not letting herself be swayed by these provocations. That Friday, Chloe finished work a little earlier than usual, something she rarely did. It wasn't an escape from responsibilities, but a conscious choice. As she left the building, The cool evening air welcomed her, and she walked through the bustling streets of Washington with a different purpose. She had a dinner plan with Ethan, and the anticipation of seeing him left her feeling lighter than she had in a long time. Being with him had become natural, a space where she didn't need to be the impenetrable version of herself, where she could simply exist without the constant weight of her position. She arrived at the restaurant slightly ahead of the agreed time. It was an intimate place with soft lighting and discreetly arranged tables, perfect for the tranquility they both sought. Ethan arrived minutes later, smiling as he saw her already seated, his relaxed expression one that Chloe had come to recognize as his way of being in her presence. "How was your day?" he asked as he sat down across from her. "Intense, as always," Chloe replied with a slight smile, "but not as exhausting as it used to be. I think I'm starting to learn how to handle the pace at Miller Corp better." Ethan nodded, picking up the menu. "You seem more at ease." "That's a good sign." Chloe watched him for a moment, feeling a silent gratitude for the way he always knew what to say. He never pressured her or tried to solve her problems. He simply listened, and that was what mattered most to her at that moment. They ordered their meals, and as they waited for the food, the conversation flowed easily and spontaneously. They talked about the hospital, about the new challenges Ethan was facing with his patients, and Chloe found herself wondering how someone who dealt with life and death situations every day could maintain such a steady calm. "I've asked you this before, but how do you manage to balance everything?" she asked suddenly, catching him off guard. "You handle pressure in a way that seems so natural. I know the hospital is just as intense as Miller Corp, if not more, and yet you never seem to let it get to you." Ethan smiled slightly, reflecting for a moment. "I think it's because I've learned that control is an illusion most of the time. When you work in medicine, especially in emergency situations, you realize that a lot is out of your hands. The only thing you can do is your best. After that, it's about accepting what comes." Chloe thought about that. Her responsibilities as CEO were different, but the idea of accepting what wasn't under her control was beginning to make sense to her. For the first time, she felt that it was possible to find a middle ground between the rigid control she always demanded of herself and the trust that, even without mastering all the variables, things could still work out. "I've always felt that if I lost control, I'd lose everything," Chloe confessed, her voice softer, revealing a vulnerability she rarely showed. "But now, I'm starting to realize that maybe that's not the case." Ethan looked at her attentively, his eyes reflecting a silent understanding. "You're not going to lose everything, Chloe, because, really, what's most valuable about you isn't your control over Miller Corp. It's the confidence in who you are." Those words touched something deep within her. Chloe's entire life had been built around the idea of being unbeatable, of never showing weakness, of always staying one step ahead. But now, sitting there with Ethan, she allowed herself to think that perhaps there was another way, one where trusting herself was more important than controlling everything around her. The conversation continued in a light-hearted manner for the rest of the evening. Ethan made her laugh with light stories about his work, and Chloe, in turn, shared anecdotes from the corporate world, always with the slightly ironic tone that he liked. When dinner ended, they decided to take a short walk around the streets near the restaurant. The weather was pleasant, with a gentle breeze flowing through the lit-up avenues. The lights of the tall buildings reflected on the wet sidewalks from the recent rain, creating an almost cinematic atmosphere. At one point during the walk, Ethan stopped, watching Chloe for a moment as if pondering something important. She noticed the subtle change in his expression and, without saying anything, waited for him to speak. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice more serious now, "about what happened between us last week. The kiss." Chloe felt her heart beat a little faster, but kept her gaze steady on him, curious to know where he was going with this. "I want you to know that, for me, it wasn't just a random moment. It wasn't something without meaning. And I also don't want you to feel like I'm pushing for something, because I know your life is full of other things right now." Chloe felt the weight of his words, and at the same time, a strange sense of relief. She knew that kiss had changed something between them, but until now, they hadn't talked about it directly. "I didn't feel that," Chloe replied, her voice low. "And to be honest, I don't think it was just a random moment either. It was important." Ethan smiled softly, visibly relieved. "I just want to make sure we're on the same page." I don't want you to feel like you need another responsibility, another thing to deal with. But I also don't want this to fade away. Chloe watched him in silence for a moment, and then she made a decision. She stepped closer, took Ethan's hand, and held it for a moment. I'm not seeing you as a responsibility, Ethan. Quite the opposite. Being with you makes me feel like I can put some of those responsibilities aside. And that's something I've never had before. Ethan's eyes softened, and he squeezed her hand back, the gesture simple but full of meaning. They continued walking, hand in hand, without needing to say anything more. Chloe felt surprisingly at peace, as if something had finally clicked into place in her life. It wasn't about solving everything or finding all the answers. It was simply about being there, in that moment, with someone who made her feel like she could be more than just the strong woman everyone saw. When they finally reached Chloe's apartment, she turned to Ethan, their fingers still intertwined. The silence between them was comfortable, but filled with a new kind of expectation. She knew that what was developing between them was something bigger than either of them had anticipated, and that scared her a little, but it also excited her. "Do you want to come up?" she asked, feeling a slight warmth rise to her cheeks. Ethan looked at her for a second, smiling softly. "Only if you want me to." Chloe laughed gently, shaking her head. "I think you already know the answer." They entered the building together, the atmosphere quiet and welcoming. When they reached her apartment, Chloe felt calm. For the first time in a long time, she allowed the outside world to stay outside, without invading her. The night, for her, was no longer just a pause before a new battle, but a space to breathe, a moment just for them. The next morning, Chloe woke up with the soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, slowly warming the room. She felt the warmth of Ethan beside her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the tranquility of that moment. Her mind, which usually raced before her eyes even opened, seemed to have found a slower pace. She was at peace, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She looked at Ethan, who was still sleeping peacefully. It was fascinating how he brought calm into her life without making grand gestures or forcing situations. He was simply there, and that was enough to make Chloe feel more balanced. Slowly, she got out of bed, careful not to wake him, and headed to the kitchen to make some coffee. The quiet of the morning was comforting, and Chloe knew that soon the world would start demanding her attention again. But in that moment, all that mattered was the present. As the water boiled, she looked out the apartment window, watching the still silent city. Washington was in one of those rare moments of calm before the day's frenetic pace began. Chloe felt her phone vibrate on the table, and when she picked it up, she saw a message from the finance team reminding her of an important meeting with investors that day. She sighed, feeling the familiar weight of her responsibilities, but at the same time, something inside her had shifted. Even with a packed schedule, with all the pressures and Robert's constant attempts to undermine her leadership, Chloe felt more prepared. It wasn't just because of Ethan, but because of the changes he had helped catalyze in her life. She was more secure in herself, less pressured to carry the burden of being perfect all the time. Soon, Ethan appeared in the kitchen, still a bit sleepy, with a relaxed smile that made Chloe smile back. "Good morning," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Good morning," Chloe replied, handing him a cup of coffee. "I hope you slept well." Ethan took a sip, nodding slightly. "Like a rock." "You?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, feeling strangely comfortable with that honesty. "I needed a quiet night." They sat at the table, savoring their coffee in silence for a few minutes until Ethan spoke, gently breaking the serenity. "So, what's in store today for the mighty CEO of Miller Corp?" Chloe laughed, shaking her head. "A meeting with investors in the morning, a board meeting in the afternoon, and yet another attempt by Robert to convince me I'm heading in the wrong direction." Ethan smiled knowingly, sensing the irony in her voice. "You'll handle it like you always do, with confidence. Robert can try, but you know he's not going to throw you off balance." Chloe sighed, though there was a hint of amusement in her expression. "Yeah, I know, but sometimes it's exhausting. The feeling of always being under attack, you know?" Ethan leaned in a little closer, his eyes meeting Chloe's with that usual calm. "I get it, and you have every right to feel that way. But what you've been doing lately, finding balance, allowing yourself moments like this, that's what's going to keep you on the right track." Chloe smiled, appreciating Ethan's unwavering support. He never minimized what she felt, but he also never let her sink too deep into her worries. There was a quiet strength in him that inspired her to be kinder to herself, and that was something she was learning little by little. Soon after, Chloe got ready to leave. She said goodbye to Ethan with a light kiss, promising they'd see each other later. When she arrived at Miller Corp, the building was already in its usual rhythm, employees rushing through the halls, hurried conversations about projects, and a stack of documents awaiting her signature. But even amidst all the hustle, Chloe felt like she could handle everything in a different way. As she sat at her desk, reviewing the financial reports for the investors' meeting, she was surprised by the clarity with which she could think. The meeting started right on time. The investors entered with that typical energy of veiled skepticism, always looking for any sign of weakness or uncertainty that could compromise the company's future. But Chloe was ready. She led the meeting with precision, presenting numbers, growth forecasts, and expansion strategies. As she spoke, the confidence in her voice seemed to resonate throughout the room. And unlike previous moments when she felt the need to convince others of her capabilities, Chloe now felt that she wasn't defending herself, she was simply affirming what she already knew. The investors asked their usual questions, probing risks and suggesting alternatives, but Chloe didn't feel pressured. Every answer came naturally, grounded in solid facts and her experience as a leader. And in the end, when the men finally nodded, satisfied with the assurances she had provided, Chloe knew she had secured another victory. Not a victory over others, but an internal victory. She was more grounded in her ability to lead Miller Corp without the constant need for external validation. After the meeting, Chloe returned to her office, feeling energized. The afternoon still held the board meeting, which always presented a challenge, especially with Robert lurking. But again, she knew she could handle it. When the meeting began, Robert was more reserved than usual. It was clear that his last attempt to weaken her hadn't yielded the results he had hoped for, and this seemed to make him cautious. Even so, he didn't hesitate to throw out insinuations about the expansion strategy, trying to plant doubts among the other board members. "I'm just saying," Robert began, "we need to be extremely cautious with this international expansion plan. The market is unstable, and one wrong move could compromise our long-term assets." Chloe listened patiently, knowing he was waiting for her to respond defensively. But this time, she opted for a different approach. Instead of countering, she simply nodded. "I agree, Robert," she said, surprising everyone in the room. "We need to be cautious, and that's exactly why we're being meticulous with every decision. Nothing we've done so far has been rushed. The numbers are on our side, and we have a clear vision for the next steps. The expansion isn't a risky gamble, it's a strategic evolution." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Robert, clearly caught off guard by Chloe's calm response, was momentarily at a loss for words. The board members, on the other hand, seemed relieved by the confidence Chloe projected. Without any animosity, she had neutralized Robert's criticisms, showing that she was in control, but without falling into the trap of direct confrontation. The meeting concluded efficiently, and Chloe left the room knowing she had once again reaffirmed her position, not just with the board, but with herself. When she returned to her office, her phone vibrated once more. It was a message from Ethan. "How did it go?" Chloe smiled, feeling light. "All under control. See you later?" The reply came almost instantly. "Of course. Can't wait." She put her phone away, satisfied with how the day had unfolded. The balance she had been seeking was starting to reflect in every aspect of her life and her work, her decisions, and her relationship with Ethan. For the first time, Chloe felt that she didn't have to sacrifice one part of herself to succeed in another. She could be a CEO, face immense challenges, and still find time for herself and for the people who mattered. That evening, when Chloe met Ethan, they walked once again through the quiet streets of the city. The conversation flowed naturally, and Chloe realized that, for the first time, her mind wasn't preoccupied with work concerns or power plays at Miller Corp. She was there, present, living in the moment, and that was something she was learning to value more and more. When the night came to an end and they returned to Chloe's apartment, she felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in a long time. Lying next to Ethan, she thought about how much her life had changed over the past few months. There were still challenges ahead, there was still much to achieve. But for the first time, Chloe felt she wasn't facing this journey alone. On Monday morning, Chloe woke up with a new sense of anticipation. The sun shone brightly between the tall buildings of Washington, as if reflecting the clarity she was experiencing. The week ahead would be decisive for the future of Miller Corp. A new deal with international investors was in its final stages of negotiation, and the board was eagerly awaiting its conclusion, especially Robert, who was always lurking, ready to exploit any sign of weakness. However, Chloe felt more prepared than ever. Over the past few weeks, she had changed her approach, not just at work but in life as a whole. The balance she had been seeking was now reflected in her daily decisions. The pressure remained, but it no longer controlled her. She was responsible for her own moves and felt in command, not out of a need to prove something, but because of a renewed confidence in her own abilities. Upon arriving at Miller Corp, she was greeted by her team, already immersed in the finalization of the deal. The first meeting of the day was with the lawyers responsible for the international contracts. Chloe knew this would be a complex negotiation, involving multiple interests and parties, but she was ready to face it with the calm she had cultivated. She entered the conference room with steady steps, and as she sat down, she realized how at peace she was with the situation. In the past few years, this type of meeting always left her on high alert, as if a single mistake could compromise everything she had built. Now, however, she understood that a mistake, or an occasional error, wouldn't define her leadership. What mattered was how she recovered, how she handled the challenges that arose. And that, she had learned, didn't come from the need for absolute control, but from confidence in her vision. The meeting lasted for hours, with detailed discussions covering legal terms, financial conditions, and exclusivity clauses. Each point was addressed with precision, and Chloe was at the center of it all, articulating her ideas with strength, but always open to her team's suggestions. This was another new aspect of her leadership, being willing to delegate, to listen, to accept that not everything needed to be under her direct control. This shift had made her a more efficient, more trusted leader, and it showed in the dynamic of her team, who now felt more valued. By the end of the meeting, the contract was nearly finalized. Only a few last-minute revisions remained, but Chloe knew that the hardest part was over. She stood, thanked everyone, and left the room with a sense of lightness she didn't usually associate with this type of negotiation. Miller Corp's future was secure, and more importantly, Chloe knew she had contributed to it in a different, more mature way. Back in her office, she found an email from Robert, requesting an urgent conversation. It was typical of him to appear right after major decisions, always with some attempt to unsettle her. But instead of feeling the nervousness that usually accompanied these interactions, Chloe simply smiled. She knew Robert wouldn't give up, but she was more than ready to face him. Scheduling a time with him for the afternoon, Chloe used the break to review the final details of the presentation she would give to the board. The international deal would be officially presented the next day, and despite all the confidence she had built, she knew she needed to stay sharp. Robert would certainly try to challenge her, perhaps focusing on a more sensitive aspect of the deal. However, she was more than prepared to handle any objection. When Robert entered her office that afternoon, he carried himself as he always did, confident, with a slight smile on his face, as if he was about to reveal something that would turn the conversation in his favor. "Chloe," he began, sitting down without ceremony, "I know you're finalizing the international deal, but I wanted to discuss an important point before we move forward. Some of the board members have expressed concerns about the financial risks involved. I'm not sure it's wise to proceed without a more thorough analysis." It was a typical move from Robert, using the concerns of others as a way to directly question Chloe's decisions, without ever appearing to attack her outright. He preferred to undermine others' confidence, hoping it would create doubt in Chloe herself. But this time, she was ready. "I anticipated this concern, Robert," Chloe replied calmly. "That's why I requested an additional analysis from the finance department, which will be ready by tomorrow. They'll review all the risk scenarios, and this analysis will be presented to the board before the final signing. Miller Corp security is my priority, and we're covering all possible angles." Robert was silent for a moment, clearly surprised by the quickness of her response. Chloe knew he had been hoping to find a gap, a hesitation that he could exploit. But she was confident, and her confidence disarmed Robert in a way he couldn't control. "It seems you have everything under control," he said, forcing a smile. "I hope you're right." "I am," Chloe replied without hesitation. "But if something needs to be adjusted, I'll be ready to handle it. That's what we're here for, after all." Robert stood, clearly frustrated that he hadn't gotten what he wanted, but he hid it well. Chloe watched him leave her office and, for the first time, felt that Robert's power over her had diminished. He would always be an influential figure in the company, but he no longer posed the constant threat he once had. Now, she was ahead, and with every victory, her position grew more solid. When the workday finally ended, Chloe felt that an important phase had come to a close. The contract was practically sealed, the board would be informed soon, and her relationship with Robert, while still complex, was now under a control she had built herself. But what truly made her smile as she left Miller Corp wasn't the victory over external obstacles. It was the feeling that finally she had won the internal battle she had been fighting for so long, the battle to trust herself. That night, when she met Ethan for dinner, the atmosphere between them seemed to reflect this new phase in her life. They sat in a cozy restaurant, far from the formalities and bustle that usually surrounded their lives. Chloe told him about how she had handled Robert's provocations without being shaken, and Ethan, as always, listened with a calm smile, reflecting the same confidence she was beginning to have in herself. "You seem to be exactly where you've always been meant to be," he said as they clinked their wine glasses. "I feel that way," Chloe replied, her smile reflecting a deep satisfaction. "For so long, I thought I had to prove something, that I had to control everything to be successful. Now, I realize it's not about control, but about trusting myself, my work, and the people around me." Ethan nodded, his expression serene and content. "Exactly. And that's the kind of confidence no one can take from you." Chloe looked at him, feeling a special warmth growing between them. Things with Ethan had evolved so naturally that now, when she looked at him, she no longer saw just a partner in the contract they had made in the beginning. She saw someone who had helped her discover a side of herself that had been dormant for so long. After dinner, they walked through the quiet streets of the city, the soft lights illuminating their path as they talked about life, the future, and how, despite all the challenges yet to come, Chloe felt more ready than ever to face them. When they reached Chloe's apartment, she turned to Ethan with a peaceful smile, feeling that, for the first time in a long time, there was no rush. They had found their rhythm, and it was theirs, not dictated by external pressures, but by the connection they were building. "Do you want to stay?" she asked, her voice soft, without hesitation. Ethan looked at her for a moment, the calm smile on his lips before he replied, "I wanna." And at that moment, Chloe knew it was no longer about external or internal battles. It was about the balance she had found with herself, with her work, and with the love that was beginning to blossom between her and Ethan. She no longer had to choose between one thing or another. For the first time, Chloe felt she could have it all.